Meeting in 2026 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We are taking evidence today in relation to the economic impact of Scotland's 5 national performing companies from the following witnesses in round table format. Alison Mackey, Chief Executive, Royal Scottish National Orchestra; Alex Riedick, General Director, Scottish Opera; Gavin Reid, Chief Executive, Scottish Chamber Orchestra; Stephen Roth, Executive Director, Scottish Ballet; and Liam Sinclair, Executive Director and Co-Chief Executive, National Theatre of Scotland. I'd like to warmly welcome you all to the meeting and thank you for providing a joint economic and wellbeing impact assessment, which is very helpful in informing our questions today. And I intend to allow up to 90 minutes for this session. So the way the round table will work is I'll just simply ask a question. The first one will be to Alistair, and anyone who wants to come in, just let me know by putting your hand up or nodding or indicating to myself with a clap that you want to come in. If you do decide to tickle your nose at any point, you will be brought in. So it's just so that anyone can contribute at any degree, make it more relaxed rather than a panel where the same question is asked and we end up with 5 people giving the same answer. So it's just about coming in when you feel you wish to do so. So, Alistair, in looking at the costs and benefits of our performing companies, what we have here is a statement which says that for every £1 received from the Scottish Government, it generates £2.62 in gross value added, plus £1.75 in wellbeing benefits. However, in the RSNO's own figures, it says you generate £4.10 in GVA and £2.80 in wellbeing benefits. So why is support from the RSNO so much more valuable than for the other performing companies?
Well, what I'd say straight away, I mean, economic benefit is one metric that we're focusing on today. You're the Finance Committee. But I think the charitable objectives of each company are the primary purpose. That's why we're here. And I do think for RSNO and for others, there is a careful balancing act between chasing income, chasing commercial returns, and actually sometimes that is in... Is that you, Michelle?
Yes. Did you ask?
Sometimes that is in direct contradiction, if you like, economic gain to your charitable objectives. For example, with ticket sales, yes, we want to raise our ticket sales and raise our income, but also we want our work to be accessible. We want to give away tickets to young people. There's very little economic benefit to go to the regions of Scotland, but it's an imperative for us all to get there. So sometimes economic return on that activity looks very poor, but I would argue that it's incredibly important that we do that. So it's a balancing act. Also, I mean, the RSNO has been very fortunate in an opportunity presenting itself to develop a studio, which has allowed us to get quite significant commercial income. I think that was a unique opportunity to us, which I think we've done very well in exploiting, but it's specific to the RSNO. So really, I think these numbers are really interesting, and as you probably know, I'm very keen that culture talks about economic value as well as social, artistic community value. I don't think we do it enough. I don't think it is the only thing we should be talking about, but I think it's crucial that we reference it.
No one's asked to come in as yet, so I'm going to ask a couple more questions. First of all, I should... Oh, how are you? Right, okay. Well, your name wasn't down. I didn't notice something.
I know, sorry, you just didn't.
Telepathy doesn't work particularly well with me, I have to say. So I'll continue. First of all, I should say that how much I'm looking forward to your Viennese Gala at the Beacon Arts Centre on Saturday.
Thank you, I'll be there.
Greenock, incidentally. But no, I think you do yourself down a wee bit there, because you said there's no real economic benefit, but in terms of the report that you've actually submitted, it looks as if there is a significant benefit. So, for example, one of the things RSNO has said is that an additional £3 million, for example, would provide some £13.9 million of economic impact. And some of that, of course, will percolate out to other communities. In fact, when one actually looks at the impacts of community in terms of well-being, the figures I have here, just by doing the sums, is that it's 2.8 times more valuable when one does performances in the community than, for example, some of our larger urban theatres.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, we are, like everyone around this table, really committed to getting out into smaller communities, and these are so valuable. But that is the area that is really stretched by current finances. I mean, taking an orchestra, taking players, feet on the ground in the regions, there's just no way around it. It's incredibly expensive to get there. But I think the social, economic, community returns are even more valuable. Absolutely.
I know we'll probably come to Scottish Opera, but I mean, they obviously do Opera Highlights, which is extremely successful, goes around Scotland, and it's like, you know, four singers and a piano player, and obviously they've got support staff that go out with them as well, but that's very successful. But one of the points that I've found was interesting about your own submission in terms of RSNO is that in terms of the funding scenario, it talked about the ratio of economic impact and well-being impact, and the suggestion was that a £3 million increase in your funding, should that transpire, would actually provide greater returns than, relatively speaking, not in total, than a £5 million addition. So I'm just wondering why that's the case.
There were some pretty complex economic metrics that Big are used for this, so I'm not sure I can give you a really specific answer. Yeah. But I do think that the additional work we could do would have real value. We are limited in our ambitions by our funding. I would love to have musicians, for example, that a larger workforce in our musician base, and a portion of them dedicated at least half the time to being out in communities and playing, as well as playing in the RSNO. So trying to service our core work in the concert halls of Scotland and beyond, at the same time as we are trying to be in the studio recording, at the same time as we are trying to be out in the communities. That's really difficult. So the additionality that £3 million would give, I think, if anything, would have even more economic return than we have at the moment. And I would also argue it had even more community and social value. You know, our primary purpose is keeping a world-class symphony orchestra performing great concerts on the stage in Scotland. But once you've got these great musicians, these artists resident in Scotland, what a shame not to use them, to get them out and about, you know. And also, I mean, it's not, look, we talk a lot about the ecosystem here. You know, what would the conservatoire be? What would the staff be without the national companies and all our workforce that service the conservatoires there? What would we talked this morning on the train about the concert halls? You know, and our costs have gone up considerably with concert hall rentals, with restoration funds. But what would the concert halls be in Scotland if you didn't have the national companies actually using them week in, week out? And the festivals are a wonderful thing. We know the benefit of the festivals in Edinburgh. How could the festivals in Edinburgh exist if for the other 11 months of the year you didn't have the national companies and others in there paying the rentals, you know, keeping them going? Because I think more and more, I would argue that our concert hall costs have risen by way more than inflation. And that's because of pressure on local government funding. And more of the onus now is on the people that perform in the halls to fund the halls. So that's one reason that our costs have gone up so significantly. But also I think it's a crucial point to make that the cultural infrastructure in Scotland is so dependent on the national companies and others that are funded through Creative Scotland. Okay, Michelle, to follow by Liz.
Hi. In some respects, I feel as though we've gone straight in with the heavy brogues in that question to yourself. I'd like to just, before I move on, take it up a level and get your reflections on the fact that you're in front of the Finance and Public Administration Committee, all of you, and somebody may want to answer first. I'd like to get a sense from you all as to how importantly you view financial sustainability. I may come to yourself, Alistair, first, because obviously RSNO report was out before the wider NPC one. How important do you view that in your role as Chief Executive? How much is that supported by the board? How much is that encouraged by government? And in other words, what was the trigger for you doing that report?
Look, I think financial sustainability is crucial. If you can't balance your budgets, you don't exist. You know, so it's a very fundamental point. Our board is absolutely committed to fiscal responsibility. One of the things I said previously in this room was that, you know, our salaries are too low, but we keep our salaries too low in order to be fiscally responsible. But at the same time, I mean, I do think we've managed to grow our income significantly. Our income, I think, was 12.9 million last year, up from 8.5 before the pandemic. So we do look at income growth opportunities. We take that very seriously. We take diversity of income very seriously. We're trying to raise tickets at the same time as we're trying to have commercial recording, at the same time as we're trying to maximise the tax credits from Westminster. You know, I think we talk a lot about resilience, financial resilience on the board. And we don't depend on one source. I think it's easy just to come and say, you know, Scottish Government should give us more money, and by the way, I think they should. But, you know, no stone is left unturned with income generation. No stone is left unturned with cost controls. You know, we had to make 2 of our staff redundant last year, which I was very sad about. But we simply couldn't justify. They were filmmakers, which were doing great work, but week in, week out, we couldn't justify it ahead of paying freelancers. And our finances are just too tight. So, we talk a lot about finance. But again, can I just make the point, and maybe I'm labouring the point, but, you know, we are there for charitable purpose. I talk a lot internally about eradicating careless loss. If you want to take like Alex does, singers round the regions, it costs a lot of money, you lose a lot of money, but that's good loss. Mm-hmm. You know, you have to lose that money, and that's why we get a grant. So it's this balance of income generation, cost control, and making sure that your charitable activity, what you're there to do, is done as best you can do it. But it's a very live conversation, and I have felt for a long while that culture has been too slow to big up our economic value. And, you know, when I was looking at the RSNO and the income growth we had and the diversity of income which we were beginning to achieve, of course that's something that I want to promote. I think it's important we promote it in this building, but also with our donors. It's important if you give £1 to the RSNO, you know that £1 is really well spent. You know, I think that's incredibly important. So it's hard to fundraise, it's hard to justify your existence without a very strong financial strategy.
And bringing in, I'll maybe come to yourself, Alec. I mean, I could see nods of agreement round the table, but picking up on a comment that the convener made, you know, if you just do the simple maths, and I realise it doesn't no particularly work like that, but if you look at the kind of figures from the RSNO and then say looking across at the NPC ones and take out the RSNO figures in terms of well-bees, these kind of well-being measures, it leaves us, it's valued at 40.5 million. And if you take out the RSNO and spread it roughly across the 4 companies, that looks far less in terms of well-bees if you take out the RSNO figures for the remaining 4, and likewise with GVA. And I appreciate it's not exact, we don't have the exact figures, but my question, and I'll come to you just because you're on my right-hand side, have the other national performing companies given the same focus? And if you say, absolutely yes, we have, why then wasn't there at this level of detail from all the NPCs and allow the RSNO to lead? What's been going on with the same focus on financial sustainability of all the other companies? And don't worry, Alec will get it first, but I'll come to the others as well.
Yeah, good, thank you. I mean, I think there's probably 2 parts in answer to that. Part A is that, like all the national companies, there is a relentless focus on financial stability. Yeah. And I might just amplify that a tad, if I may, which is to say that we, Scottish Opera, like the others, were a charity. So it is, you know, one's duty as a trustee of a charity, and indeed with the board, to be financially stable. It's also our duty of care to all of our stakeholders, including our audiences. But part of that also is, and certainly, you know, some of colleagues around the room who've been around as long as I have will recall there was a time when Scottish Opera wasn't quite as responsible, and that led to, you know, some difficulties. So one of my kind of mantras in starting at the company was to turn us around from a culture of entitlement to a culture of taking responsibility for ourselves. So that's kind of permeated through the life of Scottish Opera in the last 20-odd years. It's also that, I mean, I know there's a popular cliche of artists starving in a garret and all those kind of criteria. My view is that simply does not allow the best possible work to be made. So again, financial stability, creative curation, all of those aspects have to be in place for a modern performing arts company. So I think we've, you know, on the back of the awards we've been winning, I would say I think we've managed to achieve that, and also in terms of our audience numbers. I think probably in answer to your second question, I think speaking on behalf of the 4 national companies, we probably, whilst we observe much the same criteria that the RSNO do, we have just not been as timious in our approach to the actual economic studies. So the paper we've presented today is a collective of the five of us, but the intention is that it's phase one of a bigger piece of work.
So does that mean that we, whatever version of this finance committee, can look forward to this kind of report on a regular basis, if not annual, but because obviously I appreciate there's a cost as well.
Yes is the short answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I wanted to bring in yourself with your, just, it's in the same thread.
Table and not a panel, when we all just ask a barrage of questions. I'm keen to get as many people in as possible, given we've only got another hour and 10 minutes. But I will come back to you.
Okay.
So Liz and then Joan.
Thank you. First of all, can I say how welcome it is that you are here and to compliment you on the work that you do. My question is really about young people who are the future audiences that you will all have to inspire. And I just wonder from a financial angle, how easy or probably difficult is it for you to ensure that enough money is going to increasing the engagement and the ability of young people to participate in the arts? Do you want to have a go at that? The theatre?
Yeah, no, happy to pick that up. I mean, I think I know I speak for colleagues, we are entirely focused on the benefit towards young people because of the reasons you said there, Liz, that they are the future. If I talk specifically about National Theatre of Scotland, we are 20 years old this year, but we've had for 10 years a really strategic partnership with Imaginate, who run the Edinburgh International Children's Festival, called Theatre in Schools Scotland, which is, you know, the premise is simple. It's to take the best of Scottish theatre to the schools right across the nation. But that delivery of that is increasingly under those economic pressures that Alistair and Alex were talking about because of the touring costs, because of the pressures that schools are under in terms of discretionary budget spend. This year, as an offer in terms of our birthday, we are making that free at the point of delivery to try and engage as many as possible. But that's where the kind of well-being indicators become really important, because you're not going to get an immediate financial return and economic benefit in that delivery in the school. But I think we would all be in agreement that inspiring the next generation of Scotland's citizens to be engaged in the arts, to feel it's for them. I was at an event in James Gillespie's performance just back in November, and it was for primary twos, and it was fantastic watching how in their school hall every child could engage in a way that was right for them. There were clearly some young people in the room who had additional support needs, but it was absolutely fine that some of them just paraded around the outskirts of the gym hall and watched. They had to keep moving to watch. That's not always, although I think there's lots of developments being made in our performance venues across the country in terms of relaxed performances, etc. But that's not always the most comfortable thing for some children and young people.
So are you finding that there's an increasing uplift from schools to engage with you, that there are more children involved in this to inspire them in an extracurricular things? Because we often get told that, you know, we're lacking in music teachers, for example, and some of the tuition that you might find for acting or whatever, it's not readily available, certainly on a bit of a postcode lottery. Can I just ask if you feel we're going the right direction there, or have we got far more to do to inspire our younger people?
I would say that there is far more to be done in terms of ensuring universal access for music provision in schools across Scotland. I think there is evidence that there is good work going on and progress has been made. I think all of the national companies feel a great responsibility to be part of that activity, part of that programme. And I think we, certainly speaking for the SCO, but I know that others will say something similar, we take those responsibilities extremely seriously, but they are expensive. And, you know, I could give you a list of all the various projects that we're involved in with children from the very youngest age, our Big Ears, Little Ears project, to those in primary, secondary and the further and higher education sectors. I'm looking at our new annual review, which has just been printed, and a quote on the first page: every time they've attended an SCO performance, they have come back invigorated. It is a pleasure to see. We could all say something similar. That's from a school in Craigmillar. So we will all have some sort of evidence. The reality is that for us to be able to undertake the volume of work across the country that we currently do, it requires, as Alice has said, a number of different funding sources. And in terms of core Scottish Government funding, it allows us to have the conversations, but it doesn't allow us to do very much of the activity. The activity comes from other funding sources such as trusts and foundations and individual donors. Much of our philanthropy is unrestricted, but actually increasingly quite a lot of it is saying these are the areas that we're looking for. And it is inevitably to do with young people and public health and well-being. So I think I concur with everything that colleagues have said so far. Don't need to go back over all of that. But this is a time of opportunity. You know, if you take a different tack, if I may, public health and well-being and preventive healthcare, those of us working in the arts have known for a very long time the benefits of the arts to the health and well-being. You just have to look at our subscriber base and why do people come back every week. Something has happened, I think, post-COVID that is really exciting. And that I think, is that policymakers the world over are now really talking about this seriously, which is fantastic. We are being asked to encourage, and it doesn't take much encouragement because we know we want to do it. We are being encouraged to get into new areas of young people, community, placemaking, health and well-being. It's the right thing for us to do, but at the moment our core funding is being stretched very, very thinly in order to be able to deliver it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And my final remark on that is I think one of the good things that's happening is that HMIE, the inspectorate in Scotland, is starting to look at extracurricular dimension in terms of the quality provision in a school. I think that's a huge benefit because, as you say, that's the sort of well-being aspect, the quality side of it. And the recent education bill that went through the Parliament 4 or 5 months ago is asking inspectors to have a look at that extra dimension to which you all contribute so effectively. But in previous times it was never really measured. We didn't get much feedback on that. I think that's a very good thing. Could
I quickly answer, if you don't mind, Alistair? One very, very tangible piece of evidence about our community work and schools work is that the SCO has been involved for the last 5 years in a pretty wide-ranging community and education project in Craigmillar here in Edinburgh. A lot of the work has been based at Castlebrae High School, which has not had instrumental music service provision. And actually, just before Christmas, we were informed by the school that I'm sure there are many factors at play here. I'm not going to try to pretend to take all the credit, but certainly a factor in the local authority's decision to introduce regular instrumental tuition has been evidence of the benefits of the work with the SCO over the last 5 years.
Good.
You reference our work as extracurriculum. I think one of the great opportunities of our age is that we can actually be in the classroom helping teachers deliver their curriculum requirements. And that has been a primary focus of the RSNO, to get teachers' panels together, to get digital content. And that's not kids sitting in front of a screen. It's how can you get teachers to lead music lessons in the classroom. So, and you know, we have the infrastructure now to get into all the classrooms. And I think for us as professional performing companies, it's incredibly important to find solutions as to how you don't just present extracurricular activity, but you support classroom teaching.
Alex is keen to come in, and I have to say I went to see a performance of Thomas Shanter at St Mary's in Largs last year that was supported by Scottish Opera, and there was not only about 80 children participating, all the parents and grandparents all turned out to see that. So I think that was just a joyous occasion. Alex?
Thank you. Kind of in answer to a part answer to your question, I also just wanted to observe that we Scottish Opera have been performing in primary schools for the best part of, I'm going to say, 35 years. Happy to be corrected. And so I now happily bump into people who say, I was there 35 years ago, then my kids went and now my grandkids are going. So for me, there's something about that continuity that's really important. To Alistair and Gavin's point, there are a goodly number of young people who otherwise have never had an opportunity to express themselves or use those performance opportunities to suddenly flourish. But it's also interesting in terms of trends, what we are seeing, and I think we spoke a little about this at the Music Education Forum with the First Minister in December, increasing evidence that teachers themselves don't have the skills anymore to deliver elements of the creative part of the curriculum. So I think there's something to watch in all of that. And the other, again to Alistair and Gavin's point, we've also got a partnership with Disney in terms of Disney in schools. And I have to say, at first, when the opportunity presented itself, we were like, yeah, really? To be honest, really? And actually, after a moment or two, once we got to know them better, we realised it was an extraordinary opportunity to partner with a whole array of schools we otherwise would not have an opportunity to be in front of. Other point being, I think, if one progresses up through the ages a bit, the other thing we're doing a lot more work on now is developing young workforce. It's particularly taking responsibility to encourage the artisan skills, which we certainly rely on heavily, to have an opportunity to flourish. So we're in close partnership with City of Glasgow College, but also indeed with the Conservatoire, where we've just launched a new diploma. So I think there are multiple strands to how we can intersect through education. Thank you.
Thank you, John. To be followed by Craig.
Thanks very much, Convener. Following on from Liz Smith, she was asking about young people being involved. So I'm wondering about the kind of your reach across society, and are you reaching into poorer areas? Are they attending performances? I was at the Citizens Theatre in Glasgow recently, so it was none of yourselves. It was Dundee Rep doing a Glass Menagerie, and it was very, very good. Thanks to Dundee, obviously. But it did strike me it was a pretty middle-class, educated audience. And the Citizens is meant to be the theatre in Glasgow that attracts a wide range of people. But, Mr Roth, your area is perhaps seen as being quite niche. Do you get a wide range of audiences?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was niche at all, in a way. I think we get across all of Scotland. We take a holistic view to our community engagement, whether it's young kids in schools, in high schools, people at the end of their life, and others with significant health issues like MS, Parkinson's, and dementia. So we've got multiple programs running every month, every week of the year across Scotland, as far up into the islands, and I think we look at it in terms of young people need to be engaged, they need to be inspired. In some cases, they are troubled. So we run very intense programs for schools, on a program called Safe to be Me, for instance, which is about mental health and well-being, bringing kids together to talk about how they can, navigate the world as it is. We've got a special program called The Close, which we work with specific schools that take children out of mainstream schools and educate them there. We spend a year with those young people, doing a program across a year. We have, as I mentioned, our MS, Parkinson's, and dementia programs across Scotland. We've run a very successful program up in Orkney. I don't know whether you're aware that Orkney has the highest rate of MS per capita of people in the whole of the UK. And we did that with the NHS.
So that work involves you going out.
Yeah.
But your main performances, so you're more relaxed if your main performances are not so diverse in your audience.
Our main performances are very diverse, and I think it's this activity that we do right across the country, and also we have a sponsor. We've just done a little program called We Nutcracker over Christmas that was specifically for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds as well as the general public. And Albert Bartlett, the company that sells potatoes and things, sponsored that program in order for us to give young people in schools from disadvantaged schools in disadvantaged areas, in this case around Glasgow, to bring them into those performances free of charge and to pay for the bus for them to get there. So I would say, we're working with Multicultural Youth Scotland, for instance, with refugees and other people that are, maybe have come here quite recently and aren't haven't experienced the arts, and particularly our kind of art form, and we bring them into performances for free as well. I think if I stand in the audience, I stand in the foyer at the end of shows or before shows, and I look at the audiences going in. It's incredibly diverse, from very young people to older people, and every range of society is represented in our performances.
Okay,
with the exception perhaps of Inverness, which I think is an area that has a particular demographic.
Okay.
But certainly in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Aberdeen, completely diverse.
Okay, thanks. National Theatre, you've had a link with Easter House in Glasgow, I think. Has that worked? Has that got a diverse audience coming in there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would build on what Stephen says. I think it's the kind of diverse approach to audience development. And I might just illustrate with one commitment of a 3-year project that we're bringing to fruition this year, which is working with Scotland's care experience community to engage them actually in making a show that's about them, or making a performance event that's about them. And it will come to fruition this year with an event here at the Parliament, actually, as part of the Festival of Politics. But that's very much our commitment, I think, which is what your question's about, John, which is to develop audiences, to engage the citizens, which is absolutely our responsibility as national organisations. We've got to go to where they are and break down those barriers and break down those perceptions that certain parts of cultural delivery is not for me. And absolutely, I know I speak for colleagues, we passionately believe it's for everyone. But we don't take achieving that for granted. And the Caring Scotland project was really building on Scotland's commitment, really, through the promise that actually listening to the stories of people who have been care experienced over generations is really important, and actually valuing that. And they have an important part of Scotland's overall national story to tell. But the follow-on from that is, once you've engaged them, how do you sustain that? How do you keep them coming back? And again, that's part of our overall engagement strategy year on year, to kind of build on those very targeted interventions and then develop them further.
Okay, thanks.
Just wanted to say thank you for the question. Just to answer your question slightly differently, one of the long-standing parts of Scottish Opera's DNA has been our commitment to the full map of Scotland. 40% odd of the land mass of the UK, 5 odd million people. We're committed to visiting at least 35 communities a year around all of Scotland, out of a gene pool of about 110. And what's fascinating about that is so many of the communities we visit, the hall might only be, half this size. It might only hold 100 people or 150 people. Yet that hall is exactly the right size for the community in which it sits, and typically will be full. And I think that is much less to do with the demographics of that community and much more to do with the enthusiasm for so many of the communities for live performance. Yes. And I think it's our duty of care to bring opera to those communities. It's interesting, of course, that you can never take those audiences for granted, because there's always someone in each of those audiences for whom opera has been their life's work. So you've definitely got to be very clear about your own knowledge. Yes. Yeah.
But is there more of a challenge in the cities then? Because, it's one thing to go to Kirkwall or wherever, and you've got a mixed community to start with. But, I mean, when you perform in Glasgow, are you getting a lot of people from the East End?
I don't know the individual demographics of where people come from, but what I do know is standing in the foyer, as Stephen does before and after every performance, there's a huge array of human beings passing through our theatre. It's also one of our commitments is to hold our, what we would call our net ticket price. In other words, after all the charges and after VAT and all the other dramas come off it, we're trying to hold our net ticket price. These days it's circa £35, £38, something like that. Happy to be fact-checked, but I'm pretty sure it's around that. So that price point is not a reason why people can't come to the opera. And we also deliberately keep it substantially less than the price of going to the football. So
it's still about 5 times the cinema, though, isn't it?
Twice the cinema.
Cinema for a while, John. I went to see, and then it was double what you're suggesting.
Mr. Mackey wanted to come in.
I've got a few folk. Before Alison, you want to come in at the same point? Because I've got a few people more want to come in.
Just quickly, we can all say
Gavin, after yourself, then Gavin, and then I've got Craig, Michelle, and Michael all keen to come in.
So we've all got initiatives to try and break down any barriers. And I mean, I can tell you about RSNO with 1,200 singers every week come in our programmes, most of them community courses. And in addition, partnerships with Systema, partnerships with Refugee Scotland, we've done all that. But can I make one point? I think it's incredibly important that people from every part of society in Scotland see themselves represented on the stage. And there's a massive obstacle to that, which is unless we have secure, well-paid jobs, we will become a middle-class profession and we will have middle-class audiences. Because, if you're going to accumulate 100 grand of debt to train as an orchestral musician and you go in and the best you can earn is £35,000 and even that is insecure, you will not get diversity. So I do think we have to talk honestly and openly about what we pay our cultural workforce, about how we pay them, about the security of their employment, because that fundamentally will underpin diversity in the future.
I mean, you've touched on a point I want to go into later, which is about the ratio of permanent employees to freelancers, because that's clearly an issue. But with so many other people who are keen to come in, Gavin and then Craig, who's been very patient.
Thank you. Again, I don't want to waste time, or spend time, rather, I should say, rehearsing the same conversations as all of my colleagues, other than to say the SCO has been touring the communities around Scotland outside of the Central Belt for 45 years. Now, one of those ideas that I wish was mine, but it was one of my predecessors, and it's 6 weeks of the summer spent islands, borders, communities of all shapes and sizes. You asked specifically about our concerts, our performances in the main halls in Glasgow. You referenced we're in Edinburgh as many times throughout the year as in Glasgow. I think there is something quite significant happened post-COVID. And I think it was probably to do with the loss that we all felt about not being able to go to concerts, not being able to go to performances, not being able to be in the same shared space as others, enjoying that experience. And I think that certainly as far as the SCO is concerned, again, others will have their own stories. In many of the regular places that we go to, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, on a regular basis, the audience numbers have increased significantly, and the diversity of I am also somebody who walks the floor of the front of house before and after. Glasgow is a really interesting one. There are many people coming to our concerts, our weekly concerts in Glasgow, different programme every Friday night throughout the winter, 23 of them, and there are many of them I've never seen before. So the trick is to get them to come back, make them realise they're meant to come every week. But there are more and more people now wanting that shared artistic experience that you only get live in the room. We use digital, we use social media. It's a great way of reaching new people. But the benefit of it is not just for those people who are unable to physically get to a concert hall, but it's giving them a taste of what they're going to see. It's getting them to make the leap to come and experience it. And the feedback from all of us will be exactly the same, variations of life-changing, transformational experiences. So I firmly believe that we have a really generational moment here, opportunity for what the arts can do for the health and well-being. And yes, it's marvellous when we put on a fantastic performance of a Beethoven symphony that's better than anybody else, and it's a great interpretation. And those of us that have grown up with music since the year dot get terribly excited about that. But actually, the impact for everybody on the sheer transformational power, and we're seeing that in the we've just had a run of our own Viennese concerts in the Usher Hall, 2,000 people, in Inverness, 90%, in Perth, a sellout, and that was despite the snow. So people really, I think they need it. I don't think it's simply a want. I think they need it. In terms of specific initiatives, very briefly, if I may, social prescribing. There's a great network of GPs in Glasgow that we're now working actively with in a structured programme of prescription for referred people coming to our concerts. And we're also developing a partnership with Public Health Scotland, particularly with the chief officer there, who is a very brilliant lady called Munira Ahmed, who is one of the things that she did was she has her own walking group. It's a social walking group of ladies of multi-generation, multi-backgrounds, and she brought about 15 of them to the city halls for an SCO Friday night concert, and none of them would, I think it's fair to say, were likely to have come under their own steam, and a number of them have come back under their own steam.
I can develop a dodgy knee if you can get that GP to prescribe me a couple of tickets. Craig, to follow by Michelle.
Thank you, Convener. I've got some questions really just in follow-up to some, so I'll jump around a little bit. But perhaps, Gavin, just in respect of the social prescribing piece that you mentioned there, I recently visited the Borders General Hospital and talked to the allied health professionals, and they actually have a full-time music therapist now in the hospital. When you're looking at sort of social well-being and health well-being, how much more could be done to embed something like music within the NHS, and is the Scottish Government receptive to that at a senior level? So what we see, for example, in Borders General Hospital, is then replicated by other health boards?
The conversations that I've certainly been part of suggest that colleagues across government are receptive to it. The reality on the ground is there's lots of different provisions. So to be brief and to take two examples, in Glasgow there's one network that covers a significant number of GP practices, so we can talk to one person and develop a programme. In Edinburgh it's fragmented. So you're talking to multiple people, which makes it's labour intensive. It makes it far harder to make an impact in a community. So I think the short answer is a more joined up networked approach that allows us to speak to the right people. And I come back to the fact that this is additional activity on core funding, which more people then have to take on as additional roles to their jobs. And if it's going to be sustainable, it needs to be funded.
Right. I think Liam perhaps wants to come in on that.
Yeah, just to come in on that, I mean, I think just building very much on Gavin's side, but I think one of the most key moves that the Scottish Government could make to enable that actually is to move from the kind of conceptual understanding around what cross-portfolio budgeting for culture could look like to actually incorporating that into budgeting, and actually that would provide a really clear mandate, both in terms of resource, but actually hold the culture sector's feet to the fire on delivery across justice, health, education, but actually enable some of that flow through of funding, not just to come through the Culture and External Affairs portfolio, but actually explicitly being funded and coming through the other portfolios across Cabinet.
Yeah, you've kind of very neatly, I think, just taken me on to my next question, which is one of the recommendations that you come forward with in the report is more regular meetings with ministers. Do you feel like you have access to the culture minister, for example, but in all those other areas where you could have a positive economic or social impact, that you're not necessarily enjoying the same access to public policy makers and decision makers?
I think there's, I mean, you know, absolutely understanding that Cabinet secretaries and their ministers have an extraordinarily full workload, but I think there's room for opportunity there. The colleagues have talked about the kind of opportunity ahead, and actually potentially the opportunity gap if we're not careful. And I think that is one area. I think the kind of range of challenges facing the next government post-election is significant. We don't need to re-rehearse those there, but I think we're committed. I'll leave that to you in the first instance. But I think that we're really clear that the kind of cultural health of a nation can absolutely contribute towards the kind of social fabric health of a nation and how it faces into the challenges of the next 5 years in the next Parliament.
Yeah. May I very quickly just PS to that is that evaluation is very, very important in this in this area, so that we can talk passionately all day long about this work, but what you need to see is the evaluative evidence. One of the things in the SCO that we are ready to press go on is creating a new evaluation post within the company. I have to say it's rather dependent on what happens this afternoon, but it is something that is in our strategy, and we want to do it because we know how important it is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be into a lot more of that if we don't touch on it, because I think obviously being a Finance Committee, that's the nitty-gritty of what we do. Michelle?
Yes, on that point, I wanted to go back to the opening thread, given that we're the Finance Committee, and ask you all what your hopes and expectations are of the budget today, and also leaning into a lot of the talk there's been around multi-year funding and the commitments that have been made. So if there was perfection, what would that look like? But with an honest reflection that we're not living in a perfect world. I don't know who wants to come in on that. Yes.
Thank you for the question. I'll approach it based on the conversation we were just having about health and well-being, because Scottish Ballet has been incredibly successful raising funds for our National Centre for Dance Health, for instance, where we run MS, Parkinson's, dementia programs, as well as young people's mental health and well-being. We've increased our donations, and particularly from trusts and foundations, sevenfold. We're now generating more than $2 million a year. When I started with the company, it was about $230,000 we were raising each year. Now, that money is specifically ring-fenced for those programs. It enables us to do them. They're they're growing like mad. We can't keep up with the demand. Every community in Scotland wants one of these programs. They have people with dementia, for instance, or MS, or troubled kids, or whatever. So we could keep growing and growing and growing that. And in a way, it masks the underlying problem, which is one you're getting at about financial sustainability. Because we have to have a really strong core business that is financially sustainable in order for us to do all of that enrichment that is an add-on, essentially. It's not a bolt-on in that sense that we're just doing it because we want to do it. We think it's fundamentally important, as you've heard from all of my colleagues, that it is holistic. So, we're great arts companies that are performing on stages at the best level possible to represent Scotland, but we're also doing this incredible enrichment work around the country, whether it be with young people or people at the end of their lives. So we need to be in a position where we are financially sustainable. Scottish Ballet, our current grant is £100,000 less than it was in 2010. We've lost roughly 36% of the value of our grant, which is 2.4 million, roughly 2.4 million. We've had to raise that through philanthropic grants, trust sponsorship, and so on, and also audience income by bumping up ticket prices. There's a finite balance there, because if you push ticket prices up too much, then we get into the position of you can't have a diverse audience, because you can't offer performances to everybody unless they can afford it. So, the ideal scenario, therefore, I think, is to get back to 2010, to have some kind of restorative funding uplift in the same way that Creative Scotland had it from the 100 million in the last 12 months or so, and then to look at how can we keep ahead of inflation, because the cost of running our core business is through the roof. And I've said this before, and I said it in the paper as well. It's 200,000. We're spending more than 200,000 a year now on accommodation in Edinburgh, and I'm not talking about five-star hotels. This is going from taking the full company from Glasgow to Edinburgh to perform in the Festival Theatre every 3 or 4 times a year. More than 200,000 in accommodation alone, and now the government has just given local councils the authority to charge a 5% bed tax. So not only are we paying 200,000, now we're paying an extra 5% from this year. That's not sustainable. And how do you deal with those ever-increasing costs? If the theatre's putting extra costs on us, we have to take all of our equipment to every theatre we go to, because the theatres are struggling to keep up with the best technology and the best equipment. So we're subsidising the entire, a lot of the cultural ecosystem of Scotland. So if we're robust and we're financially sustainable and could do the very best we can do on stage and provide role models for young people, provide hope, aspiration, and so on, we need to be sustainable to do that, because the whole house of cards comes down if we're not. And for the last 2 years, the finance year that's just been, we made a very small surplus. The 2 years before that, we were running upwards of $1 million deficits for 2 years. So it's tough. It's really tough to keep the core business strong and sustainable in order for us to do this wide range of business that we do.
And I can see Alistair wanted to come in there. Just follow... Right, sorry, Alex, and it may be either one of you, but a gentle challenge following on for that for all of you. You've said yourself that, and I know it's in the order of 30% since 2009 for the RSNO, but the fact is all of you have managed to increase your income in the face of real diminishing grants. So I would argue, just for the sake of discussion, actually that meant that there was more you should have been doing in reality. And so if we take a government view, well, you've managed, and I've heard yourself, Alistair, talk about setting up an endowment fund when you appeared in front of the Culture Committee. So whilst I'm not disagreeing with any, I'm very, very strong supporter of the arts, I can see why government might say, well, look at what you've managed to do with this real terms cut. And, hence my challenge, have you been doing enough? But I did want to just pick up on the multi-year funding element. Is that flowing through? And Liam wants to come in as well. I mean, yeah.
Thank you. I guess I just wanted to speak very briefly to your first question, which was where where are we sitting, if you like, aspirationally. So I think it's fair to say that over the course of the summer, there were conversations with the government that intimated effectively, with the Scottish Government having done a very good thing for Creative Scotland through the uplifting culture, and also, and therefore its 250 odd RFOs, currently funded organisations, as well as the festivals having benefited from an uplift because of their contribution to Brand Scotland, in inverted commas. I think we were travelling, perhaps naively, but we were travelling collectively in a sense of, expectation's not the right word, but, hope that there would be a recognition that it was sort of, in inverted commas, our turn because of the lag over the last 15 years and our core funding diminution thereof. I suppose we're sitting here today going, the reality of that aspiration is unlikely to be met, possibly dashed, and that creates a whole series of challenges for us, because to your second point, really, one of the many things we face is staff retention, to Alistair's point about salary levels, staff retention, diminution of activity. But also, I don't think we should be naive about the impact of the theatre tax relief and orchestra tax relief through Westminster, which has flowed through all of our organisations and has kind of spared blushes, I'd have said. So without that theatre tax relief, we would not be viable entities, I wouldn't have said.
I'm going to let Gavin, Liam and Gavin in. And then I've got three members, Michael and Patrick, who've still to come in at all, and Liz, so we'll have to move on after Liam and Gavin.
Just maybe pick up on the sort of real need for the multi-year, and that's that sort of long-term planning horizon that at the moment the national portfolio of companies we're lacking, but we sort of, to meet your ambition point, and we have absolutely grown our income. I'll illustrate with a sort of example of why both those two things go together. In National Theatre of Scotland, we've really consistently over the last few years been exploiting the commercial opportunity of the product that we make. And that's been working with a number of London-based commercial producers in a really strategic partnership. So the fifth step, which was initially a partnership with Edinburgh International Festival in 2024, Jack Loudon starred in it, played to huge success in 2024, has just completed a West End run with two commercial producers, and then in a partnership with the National Theatre of Great Britain, we've just been the second highest selling title this year on the National Theatre Live platform. And now talking about potential Broadway transfer and a broadcast partnership. That all needs a kind of long-term horizon, but actually, to your point about we've grown revenues, there is revenue benefit to that. The more of a stake that we can put into that in terms of our national drivers, the more we can get back out of that. But we can only feel confident doing that commercial strategy if we're underpinned by long-term planning horizons from the government. And of course, the real winner in all of that is Brand Scotland. We've just had a Scottish-made title on an international streaming platform for theatre across the world be the second highest selling title. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing, but it's underpinned by commitment from the government on a multi-year basis, and actually that correctional point that Stephen's talking about as well.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's been the story of performing arts for a very long time that, ambition and resource, they're a bit like the bike points in a car, and you want your ambition to be slightly ahead of resource, so resource is catching up. That has been stretched, and I think we're on thin ice at the moment, to be honest. So I think it's a matter of choices. You ask a very good, pertinent question about government will say, well, you're doing okay, you've done this, that and the other. Salaries, and my orchestra is freelance. None of the musicians are on permanent contract. They're all on salary. So a major part of the job that I have and my colleagues is to create the work that they will then attract the players and crucially retain them and ask them to come and live here. We are regrettably used to deficit budgets, presenting deficit budgets to our board and then spending the year trying to make good, and so far just about, but it's getting harder and harder every year. Staff resource, I think it's fair to say that we have just about enough people to deliver the work that we set out to do, but it is not comfortable. There is no fat. I was going to say very little. There is no fat. So I think whilst so the other point to say is that in terms of increasing income, When I started in this job in 2016, we were raising just 600,000 a year in philanthropic income. It's now we now have a target of 1.5 million. And that's a company with a turnover of just under 6. So that's where for us, that's where a lot of the additional income is coming from. But
on this point, just before Michael, you wanted to come in on this point.
No, just you said what is our hope for this afternoon, I think. I mean, it is amazing that this government has put 70 million more into the cultural sector. 50 million already delivered, 20 million committed to Creative Scotland in the second year of that funding agreement. But I would find it extraordinary, given what this group of companies do for the cultural ecosystem, given what we do as and of the work we do ourselves, the value of that, the support we give to the education sector. The Creative Scotland organisations, it did get a reset. And I would really hope, I find it extraordinary if that 100 million was spent and this group of performing companies didn't get a significant reset. We have done well, we have found efficiency, we have grown income, but the truth is we pay too little. Our extra rates are the lowest in the UK. The RSNO, I'm really sorry to say that, our salaries are way lower than, for example, the BBC Scottish other side of Glasgow. So there's no, I mean, we've all been entrepreneurial, we've all been creative, but the real truth is that we're having to pay less in order to balance our budgets. And I don't think that gives diversity. I don't think that ultimately gives Scotland what it needs from its cultural sector.
Michael?
Thanks.
Robert Patrick.
I'd like to explore the issue of the ecosystem that's been touched on in different ways. So obviously the national companies, we're talking about national funding and the budget and the direct funding, but there's also a relationship that some of you have touched on in terms of local government funding, sustainability of other parts of the ecosystem. So, John kindly referenced the Glass Menagerie that was put on by Dundee Rep, but the front page of the Courier in Dundee this morning is a threat to funding for the Rep from Dundee City Council. So how fragile is that ecosystem given the other pressures that are coming through local government? So I'll maybe come to Liam first in that example of theatre.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Very happy to. Thanks for the question. I mean, it's absolute that those national cultural ecosystem infrastructure is vital to all of us, and we cannot do our job without that. And I think the correctional point through Creative Scotland has been very welcomed by that ecosystem, but of course there are significant pressures coming through local authority budgets, which is exactly the challenge facing Dundee Rep and the other cultural institutions in the city at the moment. But if you take the National Theatre Scotland programme, two of the most substantial pieces that we're making in the current kind of 12-month period, Make It Happen was one of the key highlights at the Edinburgh International Festival this summer, and we're about to present and tour around the country the High Life as part of our anniversary season. Those are both in co-production with Dundee Rep, and so we need strong partners right across the nation either to co-produce with or present. So the health of those organisations is really important. And even with the kind of correctional adjustments to the Creative Scotland budget and their ability to pass that on, it's still a fragile ecosystem. All those pressures that we've touched on that are affecting us are affecting our partners right across the nation in terms of retaining audiences, pressures on salary bills, costs of energy, etc. So, it's really important that we kind of take that holistic view to serve what the National Cultural Strategy objectives are in terms of, having a strong culture offer for everyone in Scotland and indeed the international reach that Scotland's culture has.
And it must be critical to talent as well. I'm thinking, Stephen, maybe come to you. So the Scottish Dance Theatre, also based at the Rep in Dundee, and making sure that you've got a group of people that working in the performing arts, working in dance, that can cycle through different productions in different ways. I mean, that kind of local vulnerability, is that something you see in your own experience?
We have a program where we draw young people from across Scotland and Northern Ireland called our Associates Program, where we basically, like a sports team, we go out there and pick the best talent available. We have more than 500 applications to this program. We take around about 220 kids, and we give them intense training throughout the year in order to give them the skills and the confidence to then go and, say, apply to the Royal Conservatoire to do a more professional dance course, and some of those kids will go into ballet and end up with our company or any other ballet company around the world, Some of them will do contemporary dance and end up in Dundee, for instance. Our own company itself, they're all full-time professional dancers. We rarely use freelancers because we have a core group, and occasionally we partner with the Conservatoire. And for instance, right now we've got a group of dancers from the Conservatoire performing in the Snow Queen around the country. But there are young people doing dance in almost every community across, I would say, across Great Britain, because young people love to dance, and if we get them early enough, train them and give them those pathways and opportunities, then we've got a really healthy ecosystem all the way through to the profession. And those who perhaps don't want a professional life but want to teach in schools, or they want to run community groups, and we've talked about health and well-being, that's the additional benefit of having strong national companies that can be the objective and the aspirational role model for young people wherever they are. And
Thank you. And the last point people have touched on in part is the pressures on local government budgets flowing through in terms of the cost of space. So the budget, is that something that various organisations are experiencing?
Two specific points on that. The RSNO and SCO have worked in partnership with the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra for the last 30 years to present a programme of work in Perth. For each of us, it means 2 concerts a year. Perth Concert Hall are now part of that partnership now. They add some other concerts, so they get a good package to offer the audience. Each of us develop and present and aim our community and schools programme into the Perth and Kinross area. That used to have a contribution from Perth and Kinross Common Good Fund that effectively match fund other funding that we receive, third-party funding that we receive, that paid for the hall hire. That went by the by some time ago, so we now have got to pick up that bill. But that whole project is funded through third-party trust and foundation money. So we work with the Ganachie Trust in a 3-year cycle, and they have been amazing partners. But it's 30 years so far, and we meet them every 3 years. We simply cannot rely on them. They have other calls on their time. So that's one significant part of our performance and schools and community work that is under threat because of the local authority funding. The other one is Inverness, where not so long ago, Inverness Eden Court Theatre was one of the few fee-paying promoters in Scotland. There was an orchestral series of about 10 concerts. That funding has been eroded, and frankly, if we can get ourselves to Inverness once a year, it's about as much as we can do because of the cost. The other thing, if I may just say here, is that we all work in one way or another with the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Slight personal declaration here. I used to be a governor and now I'm a trustee of their endowment trusts. And I know that there have been many conversations about whether it's primarily education funding or culture funding, because it's cultural provision, but it's an education provider. And I am also a trustee of the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music, which includes the Royal College Academy and Royal Northern College of Music. And the funding model in England is entirely different to the funding model in Scotland, and the Conservatoire here absolutely falls between the two stools, and to their negative detriment.
Thank you. Alistair wanted to come in.
About local councils, yeah. I took the time last night to look at our 2009 accounts. Now, you'll see 4.3 million from Scottish Government. That's more than we got in this year for our core grant. But I saw 565,000 in grants from local councils. That will be for us less than 10,000 next year that's disappeared. But that doesn't tell you the real story. You know, the local councils used to pay higher fees to orchestras and other people to go and perform. Now we have to take the risk. We hire their halls. We try and sell tickets. We do it. So there was a 2009, you were in a position where through direct grants, through hires, the various towns and cities of Scotland would support the RSNO and national companies. And now that is turned around completely, where we are hiring their halls, we are taking the risk, we are losing money to go and perform there. There's been a seismic change in the relationship between local council and the performing companies.
Patrick.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to our guests. It's a two-part question, really, but I'll roll it together to save time. And it's really about the principle that you can't measure something without changing it. My experience, albeit on a much smaller scale than yours, when I was on the board of a small arts festival, was that funders increasingly didn't want to know about the quality or relevance of the work that we were commissioning or programming. They wanted to know how many hotel beds the festival would fill. And that did sometimes create a pressure to try and move toward work that might be relied on to be a bit crowd-pleasing, and away from work that we thought would be more relevant, that was high quality, but could be challenging or perhaps provocative. Do you, as national performing companies, feel under similar pressure as a result of your requirement to report on economic impact? And the second part of it is when you do report on economic impact, the research report we've got in front of us, it's all about the headline figures. Are you able to distinguish between the types of economic impact that you generate? For example, that, dare I say it, crowd-pleasing performance of a very well-known, familiar piece of work in a prestigious venue might generate a large amount of economic activity that mostly goes through internationally owned hotel chains, for example, whereas other types of work might generate a lower overall number about the scale of economic activity, but more likely to benefit locally owned businesses, demographic groups or geographic areas where that economic activity would be more meaningful. So can you distinguish between the types of economic activity or benefit that you're generating as opposed to just the scale of it?
Do you want to come in on that one?
To attempt to answer that. Thank you. I think I'd probably spin it back and say, if I reflect on my own organisation, I think because we are, not only do we have to be fiscally prudent, stable, etc., but we also have to be artistically prudent, stable, interesting. So I think we hold all of those things in equal tension. So there's a tension between, say, for example, doing La Boheme last autumn, where we, referencing other people's comments, we had an extraordinary success at the box office, probably the best.
On Wellington, you can see it.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you. We'll take that. But my point being, I guess, to say that we saw that it was really the best audience numbers we'd had since before COVID. So it was a real sense of audiences returning to us. But equally, in the same way that no one of us goes to a restaurant and has the same meal every time we go there, so we think artistically we also have to not only nourish our audiences, but we've also got to nourish the creative teams that make the work and the venues in which we present them. So we hold all of this repertoire versus money in tension and in balance at all times. So sometimes, yes, we'll do a La Boheme and expect to play to full houses, and other times we'll do. So, for example, we've got our new world premiere of The Great Wave coming up, which is in partnership with the Japanese government, and we're planning on full houses, but we won't be doing nearly as many performances. So it's kind of partly about yield, again, back to efficiency points, but also making sure that we're offering our audiences a good array of opera in our case. Does that sort of answer your question?
It does in terms of the programming element. I'm not sure whether you're looking, as you go forward, to change the way you do economic reporting in order to distinguish between where a large economic impact can be demonstrated as opposed to an economic impact that's going to be more meaningful in parts of our economy where it would make a bigger difference.
Yeah. I think we would look to, again, holding that in tension, the question of economic benefit versus artistic benefit. So we would always look to be as financially efficient as possible and to deliver as many jobs as possible, but it can't always be equal to our box office outcomes or indeed the work we're doing.
Any other views on this?
Of our survey to actually try and differentiate. I mean, I don't like the idea of putting money into international hotel chains. I love the idea of putting money into small communities around Scotland. So I think it's a really important challenge to us to get the numbers for that. But can I also say sometimes, things that might be easy box office, we put on film concerts, we sell them out, video game concerts. I actually think they're really important, because I want to be in front of people that aren't just living in the classical music bubble. I want to be relevant to broader communities. The film scores we do for Hollywood, yes, they've got real economic value, but also I think more people in Scotland who watch films will have a sense of ownership of their national orchestra if they're on the scores for these films. So, you know, I think it's an interesting conversation. We used to put our film concerts at the back of our brochure as a kind of add-on. You know, here's the proper stuff. And if you don't like that, here's the film stuff at the end. And actually, I think that's insulting to our audiences. If you love video game music, then you should get it at the highest quality by the National Orchestra at film concerts. So, but I think more evolved economic analysis, I think, would be of value, and I'd take that as a challenge. I don't think we've got enough of that.
Okay. Liam?
Yeah, I think thanks for the question, Patrick, because I think what it goes to is the kind of the challenge actually more broadly in terms of articulating impact benefits of Scotland's national cultural strategy. I think what we're all really proud is that we exist in a nation that actually has a culture strategy that describes broad benefits and broad contributions, but is perhaps less strong in really punchy impact measurements across that full portfolio of strategic kind of intention. And I think for me there is a linkage between the point I made earlier in terms of cross-portfolio budgeting that I think despite best intentions, culture is still somewhat kept as a kind of slightly nice to have sensibility when we've got the health, justice, etc. pressures. And I think if it could be woven fiscally more through the next Parliament and how it views the kind of sharpening up of those impact measurements that your question goes towards would actually have to flow through, because actually you'd have a kind of fiscal requirement to understand the impact that a bit of the justice budget, a bit of the education budget, etc. is contributing towards.
Thank you.
But to be fair to the performing companies themselves, this report that you've done actually goes some way to doing that, because you've emphasised in that the importance proportionately of community engagement. For example, as I talked about earlier on, relative to the big performances in the cities, there's a proportionately higher benefit to going out to smaller places and engaging with schools, etc., etc. But I want to move on to some, because we're really running out of time. We've only got about 15 minutes, and I want you all to be able to have a minute or two to round up. I mean, despite all the talk about reducing funding, the Scottish Government still provides 46% of the overall funding, and the public sector over 60%, about 8.8 million, comes from tickets. So that makes you vulnerable as a sector. Now, one of the things that we have that is in this report says that although only 1 in 7 tickets actually is sold to people who live outside Scotland, about half from England and about half from the rest of the world, it brings in about a quarter of the GVA. So is there going to be more emphasis, or are the companies thinking about more emphasis on attracting people, even if it does benefit big hotel chains, from other parts of the world to come to Scotland, to enjoy these arts or enjoy them when they're actually here? I mean, for example, when we were over in Vilnius as a committee, and I went to the Bally when I was over there, and we saw actually that they have built a new opera house. They're building yet another massive big concert hall in the middle of Vilnius, and they've also got an orchestral facility for various, just for their orchestra. So they're going big on the arts, so to speak. So I'm just wondering, and obviously that's to attract people from overseas because they don't have the core, I would think, in that city to sustain that. So I'm just wondering what your views are on that. And although the public sector is always going to be critical, I think, to your long-term survival and sustainability, what else can be done to boost that, other than the Scottish Government, local authorities, etc., providing additional funding? So who wants to kick off with any of those issues? Gavin.
Could I have a go? Thank you for the question. That brings to mind the Dunard Centre for the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and you will all know where we are with the building of the Dunard Centre. The genesis of the conversations around what we now know as the Dunard Centre was to create a new home in Edinburgh for the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and the earliest discussions around how to fund that and whether or not public funding would be attracted to a project such as this was a direct approach some 10 or 11 years ago to the Scottish Government to inquire about seed funding. So what we now have is funding, as you will know, through the city region deal of 25 million, plus the extremely welcome additional 20 million that's just been announced before Christmas from the Scottish Government to enable the construction contract. And this is all in the public domain, a construction contract that is around 160 million, so that's 45 million pounds of public funding, which is supporting. I can rehearse all of the GVA figures. I have them here for that particular hall. But the point of that is not simply to create a lovely new concert hall for the Scottish Chamber Orchestra to play in part of the year. It is to amplify the power of the arts and to attract new audience locally, nationally, UK-wide and absolutely internationally, and to invest big time in Scotland's cultural infrastructure. You'll have heard many people say at pretty much every press release it's the first concert hall in Edinburgh in over 100 years. It's the first one to be built since the Usher Hall, and we now also have the prospect of the National Centre for Music to complement what the concert hall will do, and to provide multiple opportunities for participation at grassroots, every professional level, school level, further and higher education level. So that is an example of significant public investment matched with, I have to say, very significant private investment, philanthropy on both sides, enabling a truly once-in-a-generation transformational opportunity which will inevitably attract international attention.
Liam? And then Liz.
Yeah, I mean, I think your question goes right to the heart in terms of what is the strategy, both for us as a collection of 5 organisations, but actually for the government, if I may, and that's sort of two-pronged. Health, we're all businesses as well as national cultural assets, if you like, and as healthy businesses diversify their income, diversify their resilience to face into the kind of economic landscape. So I think we're all committed to that, but that sits side by side a very simple an important question for the nation, which is, does it want a collection of nationally recognised performing organisations? And if it does, there's a kind of underpinning of grant funding matching that ambition. So I think it's right that we are all challenged to diversify our business and our resilience, but I think it's also right that that's met with a commitment from how the Scottish Government's culture budget and its 100 million commitment is pushed and increased in line with that.
Let Liz in, and we've only got about 10 minutes left for a set.
Just a one.
Well, hold on, before you say it, I just want to let folk know what's happening next. So we'll get about 10 minutes following Liz's comments. Then I'm going to ask our guests to think about what they'd like to say and wind up. So I'm going to give you another opportunity to say, to make a last contribution, because our next evidence session is from the Office for Budget Responsibility, and I can see them staring at us from the public gallery, so we don't want to keep them waiting too long. So after Liz, as I said, have a think about what you want to say to wind up. We never got onto freelancers, so somebody might want to talk about the issue of freelancers, because obviously there's an issue about the ratio of permanent employees to freelancers as we go forward. Sorry, Liz.
Just a very quick question to Alex. In your earlier comment, Alex, you mentioned that you felt the capacity of teachers in schools doesn't have that musical skill basis that you would like to see. Is that a teacher training problem?
Yes, is the short answer.
Okay, right. So who wants to go first? You'll all be brought in, so Alistair, you can go last because you started off, so I'll give you the final word, I think, which is only fair. Stephen.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick up on a couple of things, and particularly thank you for introducing freelancers to the conversation, because I was just going to respond back to Patrick as well, just about economic benefit. And benefit in general isn't always as obvious as a report like this. You know, it's a bigger economics report where they have a template and formula for casting the net across our organisations, and all of the numbers and pulling them into a format is one thing. But there's a lot of hidden benefits that sometimes outweigh all of that. And I'll give you an example. In talking about freelancers, as a group of national companies, we all employ freelancers, particularly touring, production, lighting, sound. Those freelancers need enough work to be able to maintain their, a residence in Scotland, and be able to live and work here. we also need to be able to attract the best people here and give them enough work. So there's a spin-off in us all having a strong company that can employ freelancers. But the hidden part of that is that all of those freelancers are working often in the film industry, and that's the internationality part. You know, Scotland now is punching well above its weight, producing films, having international players here. Alistair's orchestra playing the film scores for those films. Those freelancers that are working for us are also picking up work with those international film companies, and that means they can live, work and survive in Scotland, and that brings its own economic benefit. So we're attracting talent into Scotland. They're determining to live here because there's enough work for them. You take one piece of that ecology out, whether it be a national company or the film industry collapses or whatever, those people can't sustain themselves over a year, therefore they leave, therefore there's no economic benefit. So there are always a whole lot of intangibles here that aren't necessarily factored into a report like this, that we have to remember it's very, very interconnected. And we're all here to do two things: to deliver value back to Scotland, back to the people of Scotland, either artistically, culturally, healthily, and in every other way we possibly can. Thanks.
Who's going to be next? Liam?
I'm going to take us back. If this evidence session was happening 25 years ago, you'd have 4 national performance companies in front of you, because the National Theatre of Scotland didn't exist. It's 20 years old this year. And the reason why it exists is because there was a campaign by the entire theatre community in Scotland, predominantly that freelance workforce, to say that it wasn't right. We, as a nation, we needed a National Theatre of Scotland. And that's something we've been reflecting on at this point in terms of the storytelling of who we are as an organisation. But picking up on Stephen's point, it's because you cannot make theatre without the freelance workforce. 70% of theatre in the UK is made by freelancers. That is just a fact. And the more precarious being a freelancer becomes, the more at risk we are in entirety of being able to make that quality output that Scotland is known for. So it's really vital that stability and kind of regular employment opportunities is provided for them.
Okay, thank you. Gavin?
I could say exactly the same as Liam about freelancers. The Scottish Chamber Orchestra is a freelance orchestra. There's absolutely no guarantee from year to year that the level of work that they're going to get and therefore earn. We've gone into that in some detail. I think this speaks to how we measure success as arts organisations, and I think the balance of a social impact report and a thorough economic impact report helps to tell those stories. One of the most profound, meaningful experiences I've had in this job was in a community hall in Yell in the north of Shetland, where half of the orchestra, because we could only fit half of them into the community hall, played to about 75 people who had never seen an orchestra up there before in living memory. And it was one of the most extraordinary opportunities. So, by the same token, we will all have similar stories. We were at the proms in front of 5,000 people and television and radio earlier last summer. So, working at different scale, there is no difference in quality, impact, in terms of the social impact. I would just leave you with the thought that I do think this is a remarkable once-in-a-generational time. Yes, finances are tight, of course they are, but it's a time of enormous opportunity where we are all understanding, not simply realising, understanding the significant health and well-being benefits of the arts across the board. So with a nod to Alistair's point about the 100 million, I absolutely believe that this is a time to invest.
Thank you.
Alex?
Thank you. I was just going to have a slightly different reflection, which is to say that actually I think the fact that we're here today is an example of the close relationship between the 5 largest performing arts companies and the Scottish Government and therefore the people of Scotland, and I think that's a fantastic thing. And secondly, I think this relationship is held up as an exemplar across the rest of the UK of very best practice. That actually there is this direct relationship between the companies and the government. It's also true that our working models are by and large, having been a bit gloomy today, nevertheless that our working models are fundamentally held up as exemplars of good modern practice. And I would take some heart from that. And also just to say that in being a freelancer, the vast majority of freelancers do it through choice. It's their choice to have a portfolio career. It's our duty to nourish that sector as much as possible, but nevertheless people do it happily, choosing to be freelancers. So I think there is something in recognising that Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament take culture incredibly seriously, and thank you for having us here today.
You and Alistair, we started and we'll finish with you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, look, just two very quick points. Just recognition, I think, of how money flows through the national companies into communities, into the wider arts ecosystem, and secondly, how the skills that are brought to Scotland because of the national companies are then put at the service of our education sector and the wider ecosystem. We are essential to the Scottish cultural ecosystem. It's the first thing. The second thing is, Liam's talked about cross-portfolio work. I think it's often seen as we are coming after someone else's budget. We're coming after a health budget, we're coming after an education budget. In England, the NHS England had 1,000 link workers to connect arts organisations with healthcare initiatives. They did an economic analysis and they increased it to 4,500. That was not a charitable act, that was economic sense. So actually, it's great to be here to be able to talk about this, about the economic benefit. If we are integrated education, we provide tremendous value. We can really turbocharge cultural education in Scotland. We can turbocharge wellbeing initiatives. That has a positive economic return. It's not a negative. We're not here to beg for money. We're here to offer something which genuinely contributes economically and community social to Scotland. I think we are essential, and I think it would be incredibly important, incredibly sad if we didn't get a significant part of that 100 million uplift.
Well, thank you very much, and I think that's certainly been taken on board by myself and my colleagues. We have 25 seconds left, so it behoves me to thank our representatives of Scotland's 5 national performance companies for coming along today and for your excellent contributions and a really interesting discussion. I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm just going to call a 5-minute break to allow for a changeover of witnesses and an actual break for members. Here, is everybody ready? Ready to? I won't say rock and roll. All ready to kick off? Okay. Our second item on our agenda today is an evidence session with the Office for Budget Responsibility in relation to the UK context to the forthcoming Scottish Budget in 26-27. I'd like to welcome to the meeting the following witnesses: Tom Joseph, Member of the Budget Responsibility Committee; Laura Gardner, Chief of Staff; and Rosie Colthorpe, Deputy Director, Economy. Good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to the meeting, and I intend to allow about 90 minutes, although that might slip a little, for this session. And I now invite Mr Joseph to make a short opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the committee today. I also want to say thank you very much to the committee for your flexibility in agreeing to change the date of this hearing following the resignation of Richard Hughes after the budget. And that change of date means you get to benefit from the considerable expertise of Laura and Rosie, and also means you don't have to listen to me for 90 minutes, which I think is definitely preferable. So you'll be aware that Richard Hughes resigned following the early access to the report on Budget Day. That was obviously a very serious issue, serious breach of budget confidentiality. We launched an immediate investigation into the causes of that, and we are currently in the process of implementing all of the recommendations of that investigation to ensure that it does not happen again. In terms of the content of our budget forecast, I'll just run through some of the key points. So the biggest economic judgment we made in that November budget forecast was to downgrade our view of UK productivity growth by 0.3 percentage points per year, following a detailed study we did of UK productivity performance last summer. But we also made other important economic judgments. Most notably, we increased our view on growth in nominal earnings and inflation based on higher recent outturn than we had anticipated. And that is a very important driver of tax revenue, and therefore, despite our productivity downgrade, we actually forecast higher tax receipts in this budget than in our previous forecast in March. We also increased forecast for public spending quite significantly, particularly in three key areas: welfare, local authority spending, and debt interest. And that meant overall our view on public sector borrowing was a bit higher than we previously expected back in March last year. But in the medium term, the change in the borrowing outlook was actually relatively small, a £6 billion increase. That's in the context of a £3 trillion economy, within which there is £1.5 trillion roughly of public spending and taxation. So £6 billion is actually a relatively small change in the outlook. In terms of the Chancellor's policy decisions, you'll be well aware, but briefly, she decided to increase both spending, which was largely the reversal of previous welfare policy, and also increased taxation quite significantly, primarily through freezes, extensions of the freezes to personal tax thresholds, but also a number of other tax measures. And overall, that meant that the Chancellor met her fiscal rule with an increased margin of £22 billion compared to the £10 billion margin she had back in March last year. I think stepping back, it is the case that the UK's fiscal position remains a very challenging one. Our debt is at elevated levels. It has risen more quickly than most advanced economies over the past 20 years, and now is around 45% of GDP higher than the advanced economy average. Our deficit has also remained at high levels since COVID and higher than the advanced economy average, and UK government borrowing costs are also relatively high. So a challenging fiscal environment, also many risks and uncertainties around our central forecast. It is a central forecast, so those risks are both to the upside and downside. We discuss a number of those in detail in the report around the outlook for productivity, around the risk of an equity price correction, and also look at pressures and risks around particular areas of public spending, such as health, local authorities, and defence, and also look at some of the risks from the rising tax to GDP ratio that we have in the forecast. just focusing in on Scotland and the devolved tax forecasts. So in our latest forecasts, we have slightly higher Scottish tax revenues in the medium term, mainly driven by higher Scottish income tax receipts. Again, that is due to our view that nominal earnings will be a bit stronger than we previously thought, and is also the result of the UK government policy to extend the personal tax threshold freezes, where the personal allowance freeze, we assume, applies to Scotland. We've also, in our devolved tax report this time, expanded our analysis of the Scottish net tax position. So that's the difference between the block grant adjustment and the forecast for Scottish tax revenues. Therefore, an important indicator of Scottish government spending power. And we expect that to widen over the short term, essentially because of the different structure of Scottish income tax rates compared to the rest of the UK. We then expect it to fall slightly in the medium term, and that is driven by the outlook for demographics in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, and also due to the policy in terms of the threshold freezes in the UK, but the assumption in our forecast that after 26-27, the thresholds in Scotland rise in line with CPI. So that is, I hope, a useful sort of overview of the forecast. I'll stop there, but we're obviously very happy to take questions on any of those issues or any other issues you have in mind.
Thank you very much. It's not the easiest to boil down a 200-page report, actually, to maybe 20 minutes of questions and answers to pick out some key points. And my colleagues will have a number of questions they want to ask. But I think I'll touch on some of the things you've touched on in your opening statement, first of all. I mean, one of the things, obviously, which is highly significantly important in terms of the forecasts is accuracy. In terms of where you are relative to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, who has been the most accurate in terms of forecasting with regard to, for example, productivity and overall growth and income tax?
Yeah, so let me say a few things about that, which I do, I think is a very it's a very interesting and important point. But, I think both us and the Scottish Fiscal Commission are very transparent about our forecast performance and about the risks around every forecast that we produce. So we produce an annual report, a forecast evaluation report, which looks back at our forecast performance and assesses reasons for differences between the forecast and outturn. And we use that to learn lessons and to look to improve our forecasts in the future. And I know the SFC have a sort of similar process they follow for learning from their forecasts. The biggest difference at the moment between our two forecasts is around our view on earnings growth. And that means that there is a divergence in our view of Scottish income tax revenues over the medium term. I think what is interesting is that in the sort of short term, if you look at like the past couple of years and the next couple of years, on the basis of our current forecast and the SFC's previous forecast, we've actually got a very similar view on Scottish income tax receipts.
But historically, who's been the most accurate in terms of that? We've got the SFC in next week, incidentally.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I have got any analysis on relative forecast.
Because they would suggest that the OBR has always been a bit too optimistic on productivity. And I'm almost aware, as you've reiterated today, that you're actually reducing your productivity forecast. Would that be a fair assessment?
So it is definitely the case, and that's one of the things that we identified in undertaking the exercise I was talking about around looking back at our forecast performance, that we have been too optimistic on our view on productivity. And as a result, we have made the adjustment that we've made in this forecast to reduce our productivity growth assumption. If I just finish the point on nominal earnings.
Of course, yeah.
Where, again, we have, in this forecast, increased our forecast for nominal earnings. So again, recognising that recent outturns for nominal earnings and inflation have been higher than we expected. We've increased the forecast for nominal earnings. As I say, we then expect nominal earnings growth to sort of fall back over the medium term, whereas the SFC expect it to be sustained at slightly higher levels, and that drives their stronger medium-term outlook for Scottish income tax revenue. I mean, I think, as I say, what for Scottish budget setting purposes, what matters is the view over the next couple of years, and they're actually currently, we're obviously going to get a new forecast from the FSC very soon. The forecasts are not that different. And the difference in the medium term, I think, is actually you could see as useful information for policymakers on the sort of range of possible outcomes. Because nominal earnings growth is very uncertain. We're making a judgment, the SFC are making a judgment, we're coming to slightly different conclusions. And I think that is helpful for policymakers in giving a sense of the sort of range of possible outcomes. Over time, I think as new outturn information comes to light, you would expect those differences to narrow when we again, as the budget setting window moves forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's astonishing. I realise we have an ageing population, but it's astonishing that they're downgrading productivity, and one thinks of all the new technological innovations, etc., that are coming in. But I want to just ask you about the Chancellor's fiscal headroom. Fiscal headroom's a phrase that I don't think has been used as much as it has been in the last few months. Certainly, it's not been something that's been talked about much over in recent years. And the Chancellor has taken on board concerns about that and increased that from 12 to 22 billion. Mm-hmm. But your analysis is that that only increases her likelihood of meeting her fiscal targets from 54 to 59%, which is, 41% risk that she won't. Why is a 10 billion increase in headroom only providing her with a 5% greater chance of actually meeting that? I mean, that to me seems quite strange, really.
Yeah, well, I think the context is that, as I mentioned in my open statement, what the margin represents is the binding fiscal rule for the Chancellor is to balance the current budget.
Indeed.
In 2029-30. The current budget is the difference between essentially tax revenue and all of government current spending. Those are two very large numbers, around £1.5 trillion each, and the current budget measures the difference between those two numbers. So there is a huge amount of risk and volatility in both our projection of tax receipts and public spending, and therefore. A margin of £22 billion in terms of the difference between those two numbers, it is relatively small in the context of the size of the tax and public spending streams that we're assessing here. So, I mean, moving from a 10 billion margin to 22 billion margin is a significant difference. And if you look, for example, in terms of the average change in our forecast from event to event, £22 billion gives you a lot more headroom against the risk in terms of the average change in our forecast from event to event. But if you like, in the wider context of the risks and uncertainties around the public finances, it is still a relatively small number, which is why the probability of meeting the rule doesn't increase, that much, even with that extra amount of headroom.
Things talked about is 20 years ago we were kind of one of the lowest indebted countries in the G7, or the lowest, and now we've gone to become the kind of highest proportionately. And what you've said in table 510 of your report is that central government debt is going to increase in 24-25. The interest in November 2025 forecast, the interest payments from £105.7 billion to £136.6 billion by 29-30. That's a a whopping increase of around 30% over the next 5 years. The proportion of debt in the UK will ratchet up a little bit from 95 to 96%, even though the amount being borrowed will decrease towards the end of the forecast period. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through why these interest rates, which represent about £2,000 for every single person in the UK per year, will be so high.
If you look at UK public sector debt over the last 20 years, what you see is that it's increased very rapidly, and that has largely been the result of big shocks that have hit the UK economy and have therefore pushed up government debt, both due to the impact that those shocks have had on the economy, reducing tax revenue, increasing public spending, but also due to the government policy response to those shocks, the financial crisis, COVID, which involved a large amount of public spending and also pushed up debt. You've also seen that, essentially between those big shocks, governments have looked to consolidate the public finances, but they generally have not done so in a way which has meaningfully brought down debt in those periods between shocks. So essentially what you've had over the last 20, 30 years is a period in which debt has sort of ratcheted up in the face of big shocks, has then stayed broadly at that level and then ratcheted up again when the next shock has hit. So, as I said in the opening statement, that has led to the UK having a relatively elevated level of public sector debt. It is now much higher than the average of the advanced economies. And as a result, the debt interest payment bill associated with that debt has also increased substantially. And of course, what has also happened in the last 5 years in particular is that the interest rate that the government has to pay on that debt has also increased very substantially. So we had a period of very low interest rates in the 2010s in particular. Then we were hit with the inflation shock following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Interest rates increased substantially and have remained at those relatively high level, and that means the government is having to pay a lot more to service that elevated level of debt than was the case in the past. Looking forwards, the additional borrowing over the forecast period adds to debt in the short term, and then we are sort of forecasting that debt again broadly stabilises in the medium term, but does not start to come down in any meaningful way. So the stock of debt again essentially stabilises at that higher level rather than comes down, and that results in that increase in the debt interest cost that you were talking about.
Now, one of the things the government is keen on, before the budget, we're doing articles in the Sunday Times business section, etc., is to encourage people to move away from cash ISAs to invest in equities. But you've spent quite a bit of your report looking at the equity market, and you've predicted that while over the next 5 years it's predicted to grow from 24-25 from 4,526 to 5,915, a 31% increase. You've also talked about the potential for a correction, a shock which could reduce that substantially. Now, the FTSE this morning was 10,146 when I looked at it, so it's already massively over these figures, which are double. So where are we in terms of that, and what's the risk and what are the implications?
Yeah, so we identified the risk of a correction in global equity prices as a key risk at this forecast, and did a scenario of that and the implications on the public finances. So I might ask Rosie to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So we did some scenarios, and this is based on global equity prices. So if you look at the US, the price-to-earnings ratio in the US is its highest since the dot-com boom in the early 2000s, and also its post-pandemic rebound. So that might suggest valuations are looking quite stretched. In the UK, that ratio is much more closely aligned to historic averages, so maybe there's less for stretched valuations in the UK. But global equity markets are very interconnected, so we wanted to look at the impact of a fall in equity prices and what that would have on the UK. So we looked at two different scenarios. One where there's sort of a consistent fall across G7 economies by about 35% in the near term, and they remained about 10% below our forecast in the medium term. And that has a relatively significant impact on GDP, so it takes around 0.6% off in the short term, and has a small, about 0.1% impact in the medium term, as business investment's a bit lower because businesses' net worth is down, consumers spend a bit less because their household wealth is down.
GDP's £30 billion. I mean,
sorry, 0.1% of GDP.
Oh, 0.1.
So,
I thought you said 0.6 is 18 billion.
Yeah, something like that.
I thought you said 1%. Sorry.
And a second scenario where the fall in prices occurs in other countries, but there's spillovers into the UK because equity markets are very interconnected. And that actually has quite a similar impact on UK GDP because lots of households invest in equities overseas, not just UK ones. We're not sort of an isolated market. And lots of businesses in the UK are also international. So there's lots of connections between countries. So even if prices were to fall drastically in the US and other advanced economies, it would still have an impact on the UK. It's not relying on just our equity market coming down.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the government UK government is trying to disincentivise people to use cash ISAs. They want people to actually invest in equities because they consider it better for stimulating economic growth. But, if you're predicting there's a potential for a 35% reduction in the value of those equities, it might not be the best time to actually suddenly move money out your bank account into those equities, particularly given the fact, as I mentioned, they're already at double the level of the forecast.
Yeah, so this is just a scenario to illustrate the impact of falling prices. It's not our central prediction of what's going to happen. And as you also mentioned, since the forecast we produced in November, equity prices in the UK have gone up a bit as well. So there's obviously a wide range of risks around that forecast, both to the upside and the downside as well.
Now, one of the key issues in this budget is, of course, increasing the amount of taxation, some £26 billion in extra taxes imposed by this budget, with significant numbers of people moving into higher rates of taxation. Have you looked at the behavioural response? Because often when we're taking evidence from the SFC, we often talk about the behavioural impact, for example, of increasing taxation on people in the higher bands in Scotland. It could be as high as 83% behavioural impact. So what would you say is the likely behavioural impact of these tax changes?
Thanks. I'll ask Laura to answer that.
Absolutely. So there's a range of increases in taxation in this budget. We've talked a little bit about income tax, so I'll start there, but maybe touch on others. And the freeze to income tax thresholds, as you'll know, is not the first time in recent years this policy has been introduced. So it's a kind of a repeat visitor to the OBR's policy costings process. Within that policy costings process, so when we look at the government's estimates for the amount of money that policy measures will yield or save, that we always have a kind of particular focus on behavioural responses. So within any kinds of policies that increase income tax, for example, we'll be looking at the different ways in which people might change their behaviour in response to those tax increases, which typically reduce the yield. So we have kind of I don't have the numbers to hand, I'm afraid, but we have a well-evidenced kind of set of taxable income elasticities that essentially reflect a mix of people changing the mix of income they get from their labour and changing their behaviour in other ways, in response to changes in tax rates, including the freeze-in thresholds. And there are other areas of the tax increases in this forecast where we take a similar approach. So, for example, the change in the change in taxation of salary sacrifice pension contributions. Yeah. There were a number of aspects of that costing where we considered the behavioural responses to both individuals and employers changing the structure of pension schemes within firms and the amounts of money put in and also the amounts of money earned. And then in terms of the change in taxation of property income, which is something we might come on to talk about a bit more, we did consider the kind of, within the costing, small effects on both rents and house prices changing the yield there. So it's a typical part of our process for sort of every tax policy and indeed welfare policies too, to think about those behavioural responses. And it's typically the case for kind of all the tax increases we looked in this budget that the kind of behavioural responses will net offset some of the kind of static increase in yield. We then also go through a process, particularly in recent years, where we think not just about that kind of within the individual tax costings, but we also kind of look at a whole economy macro perspective and think, does this policy measure or package of measures change our view on in the employment rate, the willingness of people to supply labour, investment in the economy, etc.
Yeah, I mean, so for example, in 3.16, you've said real household disposable income is lowered in medium term by the rise in personal tax rises announced in this budget, which decreases household consumption significantly. And you go on to say this disincentivises savings. And you've got a graph there that talks about impact on the on GDP. But I'm just wondering, in terms of the, well, as I referred to with the SFC, what they'll say is this tax will nominally bring in 100 million, but because of behavioural change, it will actually bring in 5 million or 10 million or 15. Where are we with this kind of tax package? Have you kind of looked at which specific taxes will create the biggest impact on behavioural change, for example, and which, I suppose the smallest will be those where it's just a fiscal drag. But I mean, in terms of other taxes, what ones will have the biggest behavioural impact?
So I might ask Tom to help me out because I don't have those figures to hand. But I know, for example, oh, here we go. So the freeze to income tax thresholds, the behavioural offset is quite small. So, for example, the policy package in the final year of the forecast raises just over 10 billion, and the behavioural effect is quite small at half a billion in our estimates. If you look at something like a sort of more novel change to salary sacrifice pension contributions, where individuals and employers have quite a lot more flexibility in how they respond. Tom can probably pull the figures up for me in a sec, but the behavioural response was much larger in that case than the sort of 5% in the case of income tax. It was kind of much closer to 30-40 from memory. So I think those behavioural responses depend on the kind of the range of options people have for responding. And with something like the structure of pension contributions, which was particularly concentrated among higher earners in terms of salary sacrifice, there was quite a lot more avenues to respond there, which is why the behavioural response was larger. The other thing we highlight in the economic and fiscal outlook with regard to taxation is the fact that we're again forecasting the tax to GDP ratio to reach record highs, I think sort of around 38% by the end of the forecast period. That's not a particularly unusual rate internationally. Other countries kind of manage that sustainably. So it's not, I'm not saying it's making the UK an outlier internationally, but it is uncharted territory in this country, and it is being achieved in our forecast through a number of different changes to taxation in a number of different areas. So the risk and uncertainty around that is quite high, and the kind of likelihood of different behavioural responses that it's harder for us and the government to anticipate as we reach those levels is quite high. So we do highlight the uncertainty around both our estimates of the yield of individual tax measures, particularly with regards to the behavioural responses, and also the tax take overall reaching those record highs via quite a wide range of changes to the tax system in the round, and that it's hard for us to kind of necessarily... it's tricky for everyone to think about the kind of cumulative behavioural effects of that kind of change in the structure of the tax system.
Okay, thank you. Now, employer national insurance contribution increases obviously has been a big issue over the last year. The OBR predicted in its report last year that it would have an impact of some 50,000 jobs, but the hospitality sector alone has said it's cost something like 169,000. Is that an accurate reflection of the impact on NX on that particular sector, or has there been other things at play, such as, for example, increase in minimum wage, whatever, that have actually exacerbated that? In other words, where are we with the actual impact on NX now that you've looked at it over the last year relative to the overall impact on, for example, that sector and the wider economy?
Yeah, I can go. Yeah, so you're right that the impact on that we thought would eventually, so after 5 years, that employers would pass the incidence on to their employees, so about 75% on real wages, and absorb the other 25% in their profits, and maybe a bit more in their profits in the short term, because it's a bit easier to adjust the profits, maybe prices, than it is to lower wages than they otherwise would have been in the short term. And you're definitely right that the minimum wage increases coming in at the same time has kind of made it slightly difficult to isolate the different impacts. And they're both impacting similar sectors, being more concentrated amongst lower paid workers in some sectors. So since then, we haven't changed our estimate of the overall impact on the economy. We have seen some initial survey evidence that suggests perhaps more of the impact initially is going into profits rather than going onto real wages and employment. But that's just sort of one survey, and it's quite hard to draw firm conclusions from that about the medium term. So we've kept our assumptions as they are for now, but we'll obviously continue to review all the evidence as it comes in for our next forecast.
So the initial report that you had of 50,000 job losses, you still think that's accurate despite what the hospitality sector's saying about just that one sector incidentally, about the impact it's had on them?
Yes, I'm not familiar with exactly their estimate and how they've got to it, but that's still our central estimate is 50,000.
Okay, that's fine. Now, just one more issue from me, because obviously colleagues are keen to come in, is that as a result of this this budget, the Scottish Government will receive an extra £510 million in resource funding over the next 4 years, an extra £310 million capital funding over 5 years. So that's about 0.2% of resource and 0.7% in capital. But you're on to say that while that will create a boost in the short term, it will erode away very quickly, and there will be a small cut in day-to-day spending by 28 to 29.
Laura, can you take that?
Yeah, that certainly matches kind of our understanding of what the government said about the kind of the consequences of the decisions on UK government departmental spending. I think you highlighted some percentages that emphasise that these changes to the Scottish budget as a result of spending changes announced at the UK level are quite small, so I think we should. I think we should see them in that light, and they're particularly small, as I think previous witnesses have highlighted, in the context of our kind of slightly higher forecast for UK inflation in November. You've also highlighted the kind of the time pattern of that, so quite lumpy, and there's actually an increase in the near term and it's kind of slightly lower in the medium term. One thing we highlight in our economic and fiscal outlook with regards to the medium term part of that is some of the risks around those assumptions that the government has for spending, particularly when you get beyond the period in which current spending detailed plans have been set in last year's spending review. And so we talk about things like higher inflation, as I've mentioned, policy around special educational needs and disabilities in England, with a policy decision to absorb the cost of SEND provision from 28-29 onwards within the existing spending envelope has not been accompanied by specific plans for how that will be accommodated and what will give elsewhere, so to speak.
Well, that's special educational needs and disabilities. We're talking about a potential 4.9% absorption of that £6 billion in the education budget. Am I right? From down south, yeah.
Yeah, I think that figure is actually one that we corrected after the publication of the EFA, but it's somewhere around that level, sort of definitely that direction of travel. But yeah, I think the main point is beyond the kind of impact on the mainstream schools budget, that's a kind of, within the UK budget context, that's a £6 billion figure that's been effectively kind of absorbed within the overall spending envelope, but without any kind of specific plan for how that will be done, either within the Department for Education budget or more widely. And then we look at risks around things like spending on asylum accommodation.
That's increasing despite the government's proposals, isn't it? At the moment, over the last couple of years, it's increased quite significantly.
Yeah, so there's certainly some evidence of pressures on the amount of money that's been set aside for that. And similarly, within the Department for Health and Social Care, in terms of ongoing negotiations around branded medicines and the digital ID cards programme. So that's just kind of that's not an exhaustive list, but that's a set of examples that we've highlighted in terms of the areas in which there are pressures on the UK government's plans for spending, particularly beyond, as I said, the period in which detailed plans have been set. And I think in the Scottish context, what that means is particularly given the history at lots of previous spending reviews that at the point at which the UK government comes to setting detailed plans for those years, the direction of travel has more often been up than down, basically, in terms of moving from a kind of overall envelope assumption to detailed plans. That will then, should that come to pass, have kind of the kind of similar knock-on consequences for the Scottish budget. So we can talk in more detail about any of those pressures I've mentioned. We spend quite a lot of time on some of them in the economic and fiscal outlook. But I suppose, you know, on the one hand, the kind of slight squeezing of the UK spending envelope makes the kind of medium-term position for the Scottish budget look a bit tighter than it already did prior to November. On the other hand, we highlight the risks around that picture at the UK level changing over the coming years, given some of the pressures that are present in the data we had at the time we produced our forecast in November.
Okay, lots more to go on, but I'm keen to bring colleagues in round the table. The first will be Craig, to be followed by John.
Thank you, Convener. Under the Fiscal Outlook, paragraph 1.13, you look at various issues, including identifying England a projected increase in spending on welfare by £8 billion by 2030. Over the same period in Scotland, there's a projected increase in welfare of £4 billion, which is almost half of that of the whole of the rest of the UK. What are the risks to the Scottish budget of, per capita, welfare spending continuing to increase at a far higher rate here in Scotland than the rest of the UK? And what impact will that have on the Scottish budget, Scottish productivity and Scottish growth if the Scottish Government continues that trend?
So, yeah, a very interesting set of questions. So in terms, I'll start a little bit on the UK and then I'll talk about Scotland. So the UK picture in terms of our welfare forecast, there was a really, as Tom mentioned in his opening statement, a sizable upward revision in our welfare forecast relative to last March of around 16 billion by 2930. Some of that was driven, I think, like maybe around half of it by policy changes, particularly reversals of previously announced measures on the personal independence payment gateway and the winter fuel payment and the abolition of the two-child limit. Yeah. The other half was what we'd kind of call forecasting changes, so a mix of things including higher uprating due to higher CPI inflation, higher unemployment in the near term, and higher disability benefit caseloads and awards. And I think the last of those kind of gets to the kind of big picture point in terms of what we've seen in our welfare forecasts, and this applies to Scotland as well in recent years, which is, although I think sometimes people can overplay what's been going on in welfare, and it's important to remember that if looking at overall welfare spending, or maybe like working age welfare spending, so putting pensioner spending to one side for a moment, given its sort of different drivers, looking at working age welfare spending as a share of GDP, it's the case that it's been kind of, you know, not totally flat, but fairly flat, maybe rising a little bit at times over recent years, with obviously some kind of temporary spikes around COVID. The spending is being much more heavily skewed towards health and disability-related spending, away from kind of other working age spending, so unemployment-related, child-related, housing-related, that sort of thing. And that is particularly relevant to Scotland, obviously, because a large part of the disability part of that, the health, there's quite a large health bit within universal credit, but the disability part is obviously devolved by the adult disability payment. And so the big question is the extent to which, given the slightly different structures of the adult disability payment and PIP in England and Wales, the extent to which the things we're seeing in our forecast for PIP, which in recent years have included a very strong increase in new claims, although we have started to see that ease a bit in the latest forecast, which is consistent with our judgment that some of what's been driving that, as well as disability prevalence, has been kind of cost of living pressures, particularly since 2022, and some of that might be starting to ease off a bit. And then also, particularly, I think what happens in terms of people leaving these two benefits in England and Wales and Scotland. I think there is huge uncertainty about that picture, both in Scotland and in England and Wales, for the two different benefits. My understanding of the kind of latest picture on this, and there's been some very good work looking at this by the likes of the Resolution Foundation and Audit Scotland, is that there might be kind of some, I suppose, normalisation or coming back towards some of the patterns we see in PIP in terms of adult disability payment as it's bedded in, particularly in terms of the rate of new claims and the rate of awards, now moving actually in some cases a bit lower than what we have in England and Wales. And although there have been concerns previously raised about the rate at which people are flowing off adult disability payment, and the kind of level at the rates at which people are asking for things like redeterminations, so essentially kind of challenging decisions made at reviews. I think the Resolution Foundation also highlights that kind of some of that's kind of converging with PIP too, although it's quite early days on some of that, and certainly in terms of kind of what the policy intent is and how the design of the benefits delivering that. So that's obviously quite a detailed answer, but I do think it's important because this disability aspect of the system has been the big driver of changes in our forecasts at the UK level in recent years, and there have been kind of conscious design decisions in how, although the kind of award rates are quite similar, how the operation of adult disability payment in Scotland is supposed to differ from that. And previous work we've done in our welfare trends report has highlighted how important some of those very kind of detailed and technical aspects of how the system works with individuals do drive spending. As I said, I think we might be seeing some kind of bedding in and convergence in terms of how adult disability payment looks in terms of offlows and award rates relative to PIP. But it is still quite early days there. So I'd highlight that as a big risk in terms of the Scottish budget.
I think the last available data that was brought to the committee was through the Scottish Fiscal Commission, which said that at the point of review in the rest of the UK, 16% of people were coming off at annual review. That figure in Scotland was 2%. There's a very significant gap to close. So what are the long-term budgetary risks if Scotland doesn't manage to broadly compared to the rest of the UK?
So these are figures from others, but that's not something we specifically estimate. But I know that last year, Audit Scotland, for example, highlighted, I think, the budgetary risk on current projections for something like around 150 million by the end of the decade in terms of the kind of the funding gap. So that's kind of the different outcomes from PIP. Compared to adult disability payment and its impacts on the Scottish budget, that's kind of their figure, and that's not something we update ourselves. As I said, my understanding of the latest evidence is that kind of some of that gap, particularly in the off-flow rates, as you highlighted, is starting to close, essentially because the off-flow rate for PIP is coming down, and that is one of the reasons why we increased our welfare spending forecast in November, and there may be some early signs that it's going in the other direction, so up a bit for adult disability payment.
You said that the number of applicants may be being in part driven by cost of living pressures. Yeah. So are those people who would have qualified for the benefit before who now feel the need to apply because they have essentially the need for greater income? Is that effectively what's happening?
Yeah, so I will say that our understanding around things like this is kind of driven by kind of a UK-wide and a specifically kind of PIP focus rather than any particular look at Scotland. But yes, in general, for both PIP and also for the health-related channel within Universal Credit, which is something that's common across the UK, we have repeatedly highlighted that it's a mix of kind of labour market and economic factors, health-related factors, so the actual kind of prevalence and severity of disability and health problems within the population, and the structure and operation of the benefits themselves that drives claim rates, onflows, offlows and spending. And so the middle one of those, labour market and the economy, which obviously relates to the cost of living pressures point, has been a driving factor in our understanding of why onflows to new claims for PIP have gone up quite rapidly in recent years, and our forecasting assumption that as cost of living pressures ease over the coming years, some of that will then drop off in terms of the rate of new claims. And we have, in recent months, and we highlighted this in the EFO, seen some early evidence of that judgment bearing out. So although our forecast for welfare spending was increased because people are not flowing off PIP very quickly, and indeed not as quickly as we thought. On the new claims side, we have started to see some of that rate of increase easing off, which is consistent with our judgment that some of what's happened over the past 2 or 3 years has been driven by those cost of living pressures, and some of that is now starting to ease a little. That's something that we will definitely be keeping an eye on in upcoming forecasts, because it's quite a big driver of what we think is going to happen to welfare spending. But I think it just underscores the point, which is applicable to Scotland too, that on both the health-related UC side and the disability side, we're always trying to look at this kind of intersection between people's health, people's experience of the economy and their incomes and costs, and how they kind of interface with the system and what incentives that gives them in terms of producing the spending forecast.
It strikes me we're doing a lot of research into behavioural change around tax behaviours. Is there more we could be doing in relation to behavioural change around the benefit system and whether or not that incentivises, encourages or discourages people to go into work?
I mean, my background is as a welfare geek, so my answer is always going to be yes to that question. Right. I would be delighted for more research in that area. I will say that, and we work, you know, we produce a welfare trends report once every couple of years, and we work quite closely with the research community in the welfare space around the UK to try and kind of influence some of the things people are looking at. I will say that on that question, there is some good research out there already, which has driven some of our judgments in recent years. So something we've drawn on quite a bit is research by the Institute for Fiscal Studies and others showing that the kind of changes to the welfare system have a bit of maybe this is the wrong term, but kind of a whack-a-mole characteristic in terms of the fact that trying to clamp down on or restrict access to or reduce the generosity in one part of the system often kind of just drives people towards another part of the system. So there's really good evidence, for example, in relation to restrictions to eligibility for for single parent related benefits in the 2010s, driving up claims and caseloads and award rates in the unemployment and disability parts of the system. And we've kind of looked at some evidence that maybe increases in sanctioning, and tightening of some of the conditionality regime in the unemployment part of the system has been a factor in driving health and disability claims in recent years. So that's just kind of one aspect of your behavioural question. There are loads of others in terms of how people, particularly those on lower incomes and with constrained resources, kind of interact with and respond to the incentives that the welfare system gives them. So I think my answer would be yes, I'd always love more research in this area, although there is some really good stuff out there, and we've been able to draw on that in our forecasts and analysis in recent years.
One of the sort of dominant themes going through the Scottish budget and the UK budget is the ongoing issue around cost of living. In table 1.9 in the Economic and Fiscal Outlook, you say that growth in real household disposable income per person is projected to fall from 3% in 2024-25 to around 0.25% a year over the forecast. Given that many households still feel that there is more month than money, is this a sort of reality check that people are not going to feel better off for the foreseeable future?
Rosie, do you want to take that?
So that's right about our forecast. I guess behind that is we've got slowing real wage growth, and Tom talked about nominal earnings earlier, and our forecast is for that to slow down. And we've also got rising taxes, which weigh on real household disposable income. And in this budget, we thought that the policies in this budget would lower real household disposable income per person by around 0.25% a year, and that's due to rising taxes, primarily the threshold freeze, which is the big one. And in the near term, that's slightly offset by some of the welfare increases we were talking about. To put that 0.25% in context, which is from 26-27 onwards, that's compared to an average of 1% over the last decade, which has generally been seen as quite a weak period for real household disposable income growth. So that's even weaker in our forecast. So yes, I think it's quite a dismal forecast for real household incomes.
It's very gloomy. In paragraph 1.4, you say that you expect quarterly growth to pick up only gradually in the near term as geopolitical uncertainty persists. Domestic and consumer confidence remains subdued, including the anticipation of further tax rises. Do you have any assessment as to what the scale of those potential tax rises would be and upon whom they might fall?
So I think I think that was largely referring to, if you look at GDP growth in 2025, it was quite strong in the first quarter, and that's due to some temporary effects, maybe some front-loading before tariffs came in, and before some changes in stamp duty thresholds. And it's been very weak since then, so a bit of payback for that, and also a general slowdown and weakness in sentiment. And so that statement was largely referring to perhaps some of that weakness in sentiment that's leading to weaker GDP growth was in anticipation of the budget and the speculation around tax rises in that. And actually, since we've produced our forecast, we've seen GDP growth, I think, was 0.1% in Q3, and that's even lower than our forecast for that. So that does suggest there are several factors sort of weighing on GDP growth at the back end of last year.
Thank you for coming north to cheer us all up.
John, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks very much, Convener, and thanks for your input so far. So maybe to build on some of the things that have been talked about already, some of the figures that jumped out to me were the kind of around the debt, which you've already talked about, Mr. Josephs, and I just wondered about that. I mean, how did we get into the position where we now have, if I'm understanding this correctly, twice the level of debt of some of the other advanced economies? Because you were explaining how we had COVID and the debt went up, and we've had the banking crisis, the debt went up. But these things were worldwide. They affected other countries as well.
That's right. So I think there's a combination of factors here. One is that the particular sets of shocks that, as you say, the global economy has experienced hit the UK kind of relatively harder than a lot of other countries. So the financial crisis, for example, clearly the UK has a very large financial sector. So the impact of that crisis on the UK was larger than in many other countries. And also the cost to the government of resolving the financial crisis was also much higher than in a lot of other countries. So that pushed up debt relatively more than in a lot of other countries. It's also the case that one of the other shocks, which I didn't mention but clearly has had an impact on the economy over this period, was Brexit, and clearly that only affected the UK and not other countries. And then if you look at COVID as well, the impact on the UK economy was larger than in some other countries, and the government did introduce a relatively large package of support. I mean, it wasn't completely out of line with many other countries, but again, sort of pushed up the debt level by more than in other countries. As I said, it's also then the case that in between those times, the successive governments have basically kept debt at a relatively stable level rather than bringing it down significantly. And in some other countries have been more successful in bringing down debt a bit in those periods. I should say, it is the case that not many countries have done that, but if you look at that group of advanced economies, it's quite a large number of countries, and so some have been more successful in reducing debt in those period in between the shocks.
That's helpful. Obviously, we're also thinking ahead. So my next thought is, well, if we hit another pandemic or some other kind of crisis or a war or something, all of which is possible, does that mean are we able to handle that? I mean, so then we'd be talking about debt going up to, 120% of GDP or something. Should we be worried about that? Because that would obviously affect the Scottish budget as well.
Yeah, so, one of the reasons why we flag these risks about the elevated level of debt is that potentially it does mean that when the next shock comes along, government has less fiscal space to be able to deal with that shock. So, I'm certainly not saying that will happen when the next shock hits, but each time debt ratchets up, you are increasing the risk that you have less fiscal space to deal with the next shock. I mean,
is there a kind of ideal level of debt, or is that just entirely subjective?
Well, no. So, I think there's been a lot of sort of international research on that question. Is there a kind of optimal level of debt, or is there a sort of debt level above which things get unsustainable? And broadly, the answer is no. It's not as easy as that. There are a huge number of factors which go into determining in individual countries what the sustainable level of debt is. Depends a lot on the wider economy, availability, access to financial markets, resilience of your institutions, political institutions, economic institutions, all of those sorts of questions. So, generally, the advanced economies, more stable economies, are able to sustain higher levels of debt than lower income countries with less strong institutions. In our long-term analysis of fiscal sustainability, which we produce once a year, where we project forward over a 50-year horizon on the basis of kind of current government policy settings and factor in the pressures from demographic change, from climate change, from other sort of long-term trends that we know we don't know for sure, but we think are coming along in the next 50 years. What that shows is that in the absence of policy action to change things, you have debt on a ever upward trajectory. And that is clearly an unsustainable position. So it's the trajectory of debt over the long term being on an upward path, which we would say is clearly signalling that fiscal policy over the long term is on an unsustainable trajectory.
Okay. And then linked obviously to the debt is the interest. And you're making a few points, especially around like gilts, that I think, if I'm understanding this correctly, that the government selling it's for shorter term gilts, the maturities at a shorter term than it was in the past. And that means the interest rates, I think you say, has been 2.9%, get up to 4.4%. Could you just explain what all that means and how that's impacting?
Yeah, sure. So the government and all governments sell debt at a range of maturities, i.e. the time period over which that needs to be paid back. And that varies from relatively short-term debts up to 1 year through to some very long-term debt instruments going out to at least 50 years. Over the past, the UK has actually had a much longer average maturity of its debt than most other advanced economies. So sells a lot more of that longer term 10-year plus debt. And one big reason for that is because there's been a big demand for that longer term debt from the UK defined benefit pension sector, because for defined benefit pension schemes, that long-term debt is a very good match for their liabilities. So they want to hold that long-term, those long-term gilts, because essentially they match the long-term pension liabilities that they will have to pay out in the future. We did some analysis in our last fiscal sustainability report, which shows that that defined benefit sector, has been shrinking in favour of defined contribution pensions, and defined contribution pension schemes hold a lot less government debt and a lot less long-term government debt. So essentially, long story, but the headline is that the demand for long-term government debt from the UK pension sector has declined quite significantly, and we expect it to continue to decline quite significantly in the future. And, in response to that, and also in response to some other factors, the government has been therefore issuing much more short-term debt compared to long-term debt.
A response to demand in the market rather than a government choice.
I think it's largely a response to demand in the market. So what are the implications of that? Well, one is that it means that the government needs to roll over its debt more often. So when these short-term instruments come up to maturity, the government essentially needs to refinance them. And that means that it is therefore more exposed to short-term volatility in interest rates. Because if the interest rate rises, then the government has to refinance more debt at the higher interest rate. Of course, the opposite could happen. The interest rates could fall, and then they would have a benefit from refinancing at the lower rate, but essentially the move to sort of short term does increase that risk to the government around its exposure to volatility in interest rates.
And long-term interest rates are expected to rise again. Is that? Did I pick that up somewhere?
So I think Rosie might correct me, but yeah, the current shape of the gilt rate curve over time is that it falls, because essentially that reflects the expectation that the interest rate set by the Bank of England is going to fall in the short term, but then you have a rise in the longer term, which reflects sort of wider factors around interest rate and inflation expectations and issues around the demand for gilts. Yeah.
Okay, and well, you've mentioned inflation, and that was the next thing I was going to ask you about. So, I think you talk about, I think the next few years, inflation may go up or down, but then in the longer term, you're kind of confident that it's going to, or you expect it's going to drop back a bit. I mean, how confident are you? And I think inflation and earnings presumably are linked in this respect. Are we quite confident that they are going to keep coming down? Because inflation, I think you're saying, has been higher over the last year or two than maybe we were expecting.
Yeah. Rosie, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so you're right. Yeah, inflation has been a bit more sticky than we were expecting before. In our most recent forecast, we also increased it a little bit in 25-26, and that's reflecting slightly stronger domestic wage growth feeding into inflation and a bit of higher food prices as well. I should say, since our forecast, the latest reading on inflation has actually been a bit lower, and those factors have come in a little bit lower than we have expected, so that might suggest it's coming down more quickly. But we do think it will return to the 2% target in 2027, and that's because we've got a sort of loosening of the labour market, so unemployment staying a bit higher, kind of vacancies are falling, and so you'd expect workers to have a bit less bargaining power over their wages, so that should start to drop off. So if you see nominal wages and real wages coming down, that should feed into slightly lower inflation. And we also think it will return to the 2% target, because at the moment we project the output gap to close by the end of the forecast. That brings potential output in line with GDP growth. There's no spare capacity or excess capacity in the economy, and that would typically mean inflation is around target, so the Bank of England gets it back to 2%.
Okay.
I should also add that in the budget, there was an impact of policy on inflation. So next year, we thought the total impact of policies of the budget would take around 0.3 percentage points off inflation in 2026. That will help bring it down a bit, although there's a bit of a little bit of upward pressure on the next year as fuel duty rises as well.
Okay, and thanks. I think the final thing I was going to ask you about this, I mean, I think the UK government's committing to just one fiscal event a year, but you're still going to do two forecasts. Is that how it's working?
Yeah, so that is correct. So what the Chancellor has announced is that the spring forecast, which will be on the 3rd of March, will be a full forecast from us. So we will produce a full 5-year forecast covering everything that we currently cover, the economy and the public finances. But we will not make a formal assessment of whether or not the government is meeting the fiscal rules. We will only do that at the time of the autumn budget. And the Chancellor has also said that she will not announce a policy alongside the spring forecast. I think she said, except in exceptional circumstances or language similar to that. So this is an approach which actually is quite common in lots of countries, where you have one major fiscal policy setting event a year, and the other forecast is more a kind of preliminary forecast which, if you like, sets the context, provides an update on the position of the economy and the public finances, allows the government and Parliament and the public to start thinking about the wider context of the public finances, to start thinking about policy options ahead of the main budget event.
So it's a bit of a technicality. It's not going to have any practical impact, really?
Well, I think the practical impacts will be, as I say, mainly that there will not be a policy announcement. As
so the focus will be in the autumn then?
Yes. Other than in exceptional circumstances. So it has been the case over many years in the UK that essentially you've had two major UK fiscal policy setting events a year. and the Chancellor has said her intention is to move to only one. So that would be the main impact, practical impact.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Just before I move on to Michael, who will be followed by Liz, when will the UK national debt top 3 trillion? We're about 99% of the way there, I understand.
So in our forecast, debt, I believe on all of, I mean, there are various different measures of public debt, but I think on all of them in our forecast, it remains below 100% of GDP over the forecast period, but is very close to it. So, as we've said, there are a lot of risks around those forecasts. So there is risk that debt rises more quickly and tops that number. I mean, I would say there's nothing particularly magic about that number.
The media will jump on it, but
I think, you know, from the point of view of sort of economic and public finance analysis, there's nothing particularly special about 100% of GDP debt, but it is, again, you know, it would be, and already is in our forecast, I've said, you know, debt is at a very elevated level in the UK compared to the past out in peacetime, and high compared to many other countries around the world, so it does represent a significant risk.
Okay. Michael.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Thanks for being with us today. You might notice the Parliament's controlling its costs by keeping the temperature in this room really dramatically low. So it's absolutely freezing again this morning. You'll know that this is the Scottish budget this afternoon, and lots of demands for and concerns about the state of public services in Scotland and common with the rest of the UK. Obviously, one thing that would help with some of that if there was increased funding. Further increased funding for the Scottish Government to allow them to do other things. What would the impact be if on the UK finances, if, for instance, the UK Chancellor was to decide to spend an additional £50 billion on public services?
Well, I guess, I mean, the answer to that question really depends on whether or not that increase in public spending was funded or not. So,
let's assume unfunded.
Well, so I mean, an additional £50 billion a year on public spending without any increase in taxation would obviously translate into £50 billion increase in borrowing, and you know, that would obviously be a very significant increase. I think on what is interesting, and I pointed out in my opening statement, is that the UK deficit, UK borrowing, has been at a relatively elevated level since COVID. So obviously in COVID, borrowing shot up to very high levels. It came down immediately after COVID, but has remained at around 5% of GDP since then. And that is despite the fact that if you looked at sort of successive budgets and therefore successive forecasts from us based on government plans since COVID, you would have seen an expectation or a forecast that borrowing would fall from that 5% GDP level down to around sort of 2% of GDP or so. And that has not actually happened. And that has been a result of both subsequent economic shocks that have come along after COVID, most notably the energy price shock, but also essentially decisions by successive governments to not consolidate the public finances as quickly as previously planned. And, you know, kind of what you're talking about, I guess, is would be sort of doing that again. And I say that would just increase the risk around the position of the public finances in the UK and lead to higher debt, even higher debt than we have in our current projections, and increase the debt interest costs that the convener was talking about at the start of the session.
What if that was £90 billion?
well, then it would represent even, an even bigger risk. I think.
No, I was just going to add on this. This what if. You sort of present in that context. I think the government's shown a great deal of kind of commitment to its fiscal rules, and assuming we're focusing mainly on public services here, as you mentioned in your question, that sort of, if unfunded, translates directly through to the kind of margin against the meeting of the binding fiscal rule, which is to have a current surplus in 29-30. So as you know, the margin in the latest forecast is 22 billion. So the numbers you're talking about are kind of well the other side of that, and would result in the government not meeting its fiscal rules if unfunded. And I think there the questions would be how those who lend to the UK government would respond to that. This is a what-if game, right? So I have no idea. But the fiscal rules, as we've said previously, are kind of comparatively loose compared to previous iterations of fiscal rules, although are tightening in the sense that the target year is coming forward, which is a commendable aspect of them. Particularly when the target year falls within the period when there is actually kind of detailed plans for current spending as well as capital spending. But I think in this what-if thing, there'd also be an aspect of whether that's kind of completely eroding whatever fiscal space the government has and would cause some kind of adverse reaction in the gilt markets in terms of people's willingness to lend to something that pushed the government's fiscal position well the other side of its stated fiscal commitments.
And you would assume that would happen, because on the basis of, we've had an experiment in this regard under the previous government in the UK, where there was £45 billion of fiscal expansion with no funding attached to it. There was a reaction in the markets, it's fair to say, over that period, and there were consequences as a result of that, isn't there?
Yeah, so I think these things are highly context-specific, so it would absolutely depend on the way the government described this, what the government said about its fiscal intentions, if it was kind of changing its approach there, and the circumstances that had driven this kind of this change in approach. And we're very much in the hypothetical now, and I'm absolutely not advocating for any approach. Let's give an example of when public spending rose massively and unexpectedly very quickly in recent years. The COVID pandemic, right? That was absolutely a situation in which there was total consensus among different political parties, commentators and market participants that was a kind of emergency that warranted direct public spending support for households and the economy. And the kind of fiscal rules were kind of put to one side and everything else was put to one side in that context. So there's totally different reasons why you might massively increase day-to-day spending and as a result totally different, and how you would contextualise that in the context of your fiscal strategy, particularly with regards to the fiscal rules, and the markets would absolutely react with that context in mind. So there's a range of different ways in which this could play out. But you point to 2022, an example of where maybe kind of the circumstances weren't as I described in COVID, and we have seen evidence of how the markets can react. So it's not clear that we have acres of fiscal space in the UK to kind of delve into in any context.
So are these kind of demands viable or reasonable then?
Well, I mean, we are talking... There is obviously the option of funding any changes in public spending via changes in taxation. We've talked about taxation a little bit previously. As I said, the tax to GDP ratio is forecast to reach record highs in the UK, but there are countries that have higher tax to GDP ratios on a sustained basis, and that would be, any change of that nature would be consistent with the government's fiscal rules. And that's just a policy choice, essentially. The level of public services you want and the level of taxes you are willing to have to fund that. So I think if you move from the unfunded space to the funded space, it's just a kind of a much more of a kind of policy question.
I suppose this is the challenge. The Scottish Government, since the current UK Government's elected in 2024, has demanded an additional £95 billion of expenditure and has opposed £45 billion of revenue raisers. So that is a fiscal shift of £140 billion in demands from the Scottish Government of the UK Exchequer. So it is unfunded that they're asking for. What would the consequences of a fiscal expansion of £140 billion be to the UK economy?
Done 50, 90 and now 140.
Yeah, like, I think, you know, it's...
I mean,
it's
it is
not really,
ridiculous, I agree, and it is Argentina kind of at levels, but it's the Scottish Government that are making the demands. So
I mean, it's
what
not
would
really
the
possible for us
consequences
to
be?
comment...
The Labour Party.
It's not really possible for us to comment on that, and, you know, a very clear part of our remit is to not comment on kind of political policy positions. We are tasked with only assessing the consequences of announced UK government policy. So we are very careful to sort of avoid trying to comment on kind of alternative policy positions of the sort that you're setting out.
I think that's, well, I'm trying to explore the policy space as you've set out. So there is a proposition that's been made by the Scottish Government. You're talking about fiscal headroom and what the impact of that would be. You must have a view in terms of, as the OBR, if there were to be a very sudden expansion in government funding of public services without any commensurate increase in taxation, what the impact of that would be. That's a reasonable
I think
question.
We've talked, and Laura and I have both talked, I think, clearly about the risks, the potential risks associated with increases in borrowing, but we can't really, and it would, it's just not right for us to comment on kind of specific alternative policy proposals. That is very clearly something that our legislation says that we should not do.
And within that, I mean, so the Scottish Government can make these demands, publicly, and they are political demands, clearly. But the Permanent Secretary of the Scottish Government wrote to me saying, in making representations at UK fiscal events, it is not for the Scottish Government to undertake costing of UK government reserve policies, nor to identify or quantify alternative revenue-raising options. So apparently it's not his job either, in terms of the head of the government to make the civil service to make these demands. It's not on you to cost them. In terms of how this operates, I get that you're responsible for costing UK government policies rather than the politics of what's happening here. There's a missing space, really, where a constituent part of the UK is making unfunded demands of the government and nobody is actually costing that out. Is that not a problem in terms of the operation of the fiscal framework and the way that the politics of this operates?
I mean, I'm sorry, I haven't seen that statement, so really it would not be right for me to comment on that. Sorry.
Then moving on to a different area, you'll be glad to hear. I'm sure colleagues will be too. Your issues around productivity. I suppose it's fair to say that the picture that you paint is quite a gloomy one, I think, in terms of not just the downgrade that you've made, but I suppose the picture is of significant exogenous factors impacting the global environment, little prospect as far as you can see. It would seem to me of an uptick in productivity improvements. Is that a fair assessment of what you've set out?
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, we've downgraded our medium-term assumption for productivity from 1.3 to 1%. And to put that in some context, the average in the decade before the financial crisis was just over 2%, and the average since then is around 0.5%. So you could see it as relatively optimistic that productivity growth is going to pick up towards 1%, that's sort of double the rate we've seen in recent years, or you could see it as relatively pessimistic that it's going to remain at half the rate from before the financial crisis. So some of the reasons we think it will actually pick up from recent kind of lows of around 0.5% is that the UK is obviously, we've touched on a bit earlier, to do with debt, has experienced quite a lot of shocks that have impacted productivity, most recently the energy crisis, the European energy crisis, and the impact of COVID. And they would have had an impact on UK productivity, so as those fade, we should see productivity in our central forecast pick up a little bit, back somewhat towards those pre-financial crisis averages, but not all the way towards it. And we've also got the impact of a building impact of AI in our forecast. So that's We see that as the next general purpose technology. So before the financial crisis, we had the ICT revolution, which contributed a lot to productivity growth. And we think AI will be the next one of those, and the impact will pick up a bit over our forecast. The 0.2 we've got on growth by our 5-year horizon, that's quite a lot less than the ICT revolution did before the financial crisis. And we do see that picking up a bit over the rest of the decade. And there's also a lot of uncertainty around that. So if you look at external estimates of the impact of AI on the UK and advanced economies, they range from, I think, something like 0.1% on the level to about 3% on the level. We've gone, on the growth rate, so we've gone for something kind of broadly in the middle, not too optimistic, but not at the pessimistic end, because there's a lot of uncertainty around it. I should also say there's a lot of uncertainty around the central forecast of productivity. It's a very difficult judgment to make because it depends on these big waves of technology that come along that can be very hard to predict. And so in our EFO and in our productivity paper we published, we also did some scenarios. So one of which on the downside is if productivity growth remained at around 0.5%, so followed the average of the last decade or so, and that would obviously have lead to much lower growth in the UK and put us in a much worse fiscal position. An upside one could be that productivity growth returns to about 1.5%, so that's more like halfway between the pre- and post-financial crisis decades. So that could be seen as sort of an average of those two periods. And that's maybe with more of an impact of AI and more of the recent weakness being down to the shocks that have hit the economy rather than reflecting the underlying structural factors that we expect to continue. So that's quite a wide range of impacts that you could have, but we've gone for something in the middle for our central forecast.
I mean, you're leaning quite heavily on this technological waves, and rather than necessarily a kind of a total factor productivity measurement. And Scottish Fiscal Commission, I think, have been talking about more the latter rather than just waiting for technology moments to arrive. I mean, it sounds like you're still kind of saying we're, in essence, that on a policy level, we're just a bit of hostage to fortune on all of this, and that there's no real, because the other things you're identifying is, ageing population, and that's also more acute in Scotland. So I suppose I'm trying to explore thinking about what we might do as a set of institutions in Scotland to try and change our productivity pathway. But the message I'm taking from your report is actually we're just going to have to wait and see if a major technology comes along and changes the direction rather than a policy level adjustment.
So I think it's definitely right that these waves of technology are very important drivers. And as we've kind of shown in the paper, there's lower productivity growth across advanced economies as well. So it's not just a sort of UK-specific issue either. However, like the OBRs we've just talked about isn't here to comment on sort of specific policy proposals or alternative policies. But if you look back at the last few years, there are examples of government policies that we have incorporated in our forecast that have increased productivity growth. So to give a couple of examples, one is trade. So on the downside, you've had Brexit impacting productivity. On the upside, the UK has signed a number of trade deals with different trading partners since Brexit, which we expect to uplift productivity. I think in total, in the long term, it's by around 0.25 percentage point from all those different deals. That's obviously a positive. Unfortunately, it's outweighed by the Brexit, negative, which is around 4% over the long term. We've also increased our productivity from the impact of the UK government's planning reforms, and that's allowing the construction sector to make more productive use of the land that's released for development. And then on the kind of capital deepening side, the big increase in public investment from this government, I think it was last November, had an increase in productivity of around 0.1 to 0.2% at our forecast horizon. And we've also had increases or decreases in productivity from policies that impact business investments. So that's things like corporation tax and the super deduction, which affect the business's cost of capital and therefore in their incentive to invest. So there are policies in the last 5 years. You can draw on lots of examples of where governments have impacted the rate of productivity growth in our forecast. So I think there definitely are ways that it can do that in the way we forecast it.
Okay, thank you.
Question from me. Given the analysis that you've given us this morning, which, as some colleagues have said, is a bit depressing, do you think that there is a real commitment within the UK government to reform, particularly the tax system, because obviously it's got complexities that other countries don't have? Is there a commitment there?
Well, what you have seen over the last two budgets from this government has been a very large set of tax changes. I mean, it's certainly been the case that, I mean, we can't speak for the government in terms of their objectives there, but clearly they have been reflecting a wide number of objectives, some of which is fiscal, i.e. they have been looked to increase revenue from taxation in order to increase public spending and therefore meet their fiscal rules.
There was a lot of commentary at the time of the budget, not just about that, but about whether specific reforms to the actual tax system itself could help to unlock some of the issues that we've got in the UK economy. Is that something, I'm not asking you to comment whether it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, do you think there's a commitment within the UK government to do that?
Well, I mean, I think that is really a question for the UK government that you would need to ask them. I mean, our role is to assess the cost and impact of the policies that the government chooses to announce, and sort of why they choose to announce those is a matter for them. But again, it's certainly the case that they have introduced a large number of changes to taxation. Some, I think, with clearly a fiscal objective in mind in order to pay for increases in public spending, but some which have had more specific policy objectives in mind as well. So one example in the recent budget, for example, was the introduction of taxation on electric vehicles, which I think the government would say had a fiscal objective, but a number of other policy objectives. So
just to be clear, the OBR is not being asked by the UK government to do any analysis of possible changes to the structure of taxation. Is that correct?
So what we do is just assess the impact of the tax policy changes that the government chooses to announce.
The current ones, right?
Yeah,
okay.
We don't do any other sort of work for the government on taxation taxation policy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of more questions for me on issues we've not really touched on. So, for example, I mean, the increasing tax on property income and savings income by 2 percentage points at the basic, higher and additional rates from April next year. Now, the budget says that the UK government intends to engage with the devolved governments of Scotland and Wales to provide them with the ability to set property income rates in line with the current income tax powers and the fiscal frameworks. And in its reaction blog on the UK budget, the Scottish Parliament Information Centre said in a quote that once the Scottish Parliament has the powers to set income tax rates to property, it will presumably face a choice between at least matching the rates for England or accepting a block grant adjustment, which will reduce funding for the Scottish budget. So I'm just wondering if you can tell me what the implications of this policy are for savers and those letting out properties and tenants.
Yeah, sure. So I focus a little bit on the property side, because that's obviously got the most direct implications for the Scottish government being part of the kind of devolved set of taxes. So at the UK level, but I mean the kind of implications are similar on the savings side. At the UK level, when we looked at this policy, I talked earlier in the session about kind of behavioural effects of different tax policies. In this case, our considerations included impacts on the kind of the property market. And so over our forecast, the yield from the increase in taxation was slightly offset by a negative impact of the tax on house prices, which more than offset a slight upward effect on rents in terms of the relative
There's
tax.
also an implication that will reduce the number of flats available for rent.
Yeah, so
is that correct?
That's true. So particularly over the long term. So now, in recent years, in our economic and fiscal outlooks, we've had a specific section on the long-term implications of policy. So in that context, we particularly highlighted that this policy, in the context of various changes to the tax treatment of landlords and property income over the past decade, have reduced returns to private landlords, and you might expect that to reduce the supply of rental properties and therefore increase rents over the long run. So we did flag that as a kind of risk from this policy in the context of a number of different policy changes in the landlord and rental property space.
And if the Scottish Government decides not to copy the UK Government, what will be the implications in terms of block grant adjustment?
So I don't have the I don't have the specific figures to hand, I'm afraid, but I think it is essentially a straight choice between a proportionate reduction in the block grant adjustment relative to the yield at the UK level, which we estimated at about £500 million. So others will know better than me how those kind of things translate. I'm sorry I don't have that time, but there's the revenue at the UK level from the property part of this, which is the most relevant part in the Scottish budget context, is £500 million. So that kind of translates through in the usual way. So I think at the Scotland level, it is a sort of a direct choice between matching, or at least matching, the UK government policy on property, rates of tax on property income, when the kind of powers have been put in place to do so, which I understand is something that the governments are working together on. And as I think other witnesses to this committee have mentioned, thinking about the implications of those changes for the Scottish rental market in the context of other changes to the treatment of Scottish landlords over the past decade, and particularly the relatively high rates of
but the impact could
property transaction tax in Scotland.
Could be the order of tens of millions of pounds.
That sounds about right to me, thinking about the kind of usual kind of 10% or so proportions, but yeah.
Thank you. Now, in terms of capital, you've said in 2.49 of your report, a relatively high cost of capital and a weak rate of return together generate a modest decline in investment as a share of GDP over the forecast. And you go on to say that the cost of capital has risen over recent years and the real return on capital is at a historically low level. Investment intentions and business confidence also remain subdued. So what do you perceive to be the impact on growth of that?
So, you're right. We've seen the real rate of return for businesses trend down over the last few years and reach relatively low levels. Although I should say recent ONS revisions have made the picture look a little bit less bad than they did maybe a year ago as well. So it looks like a less bad position for businesses.
It's still bad.
Yes, still bad, but a little bit less bad than it was. So over our forecast, we think businesses will try and rebuild some of their rate of return and rebuild their profit. So the profit share of GDP should rise a little bit and the rate of return should go up a bit as well. We've also seen another revision from the ONS was to business investment, which pushed the level of that as a share of GDP up compared to what we previously thought. So the picture for business investment looked a little bit better. And so we think that this relatively weak rates of return, although increasing a little bit, and this high cost of capital, we've talked quite a lot about interest rates, which will feed through to businesses' borrowing costs as well, will together weigh on business investment. So we have business investment as a share of GDP trending down a little bit over our forecast. It's sort of broadly flat in a wider context, but going down a little bit. And that will feed into sort of the capital stock and therefore a capital deepening forecast. So that will be kind of a little bit like if business investment was going up as a share of GDP, that would kind of build up the capital stock and contribute to productivity growth. As it's sort of flat and slightly falling as a share of GDP, that part of our productivity forecast is a little bit worse.
We had a significant boost to capital in the current financial year, but that's going to reduce such that by 29-30 it will be lower than it was in 23-24. So clearly, I mean, my concern about that was you get inflationary impacts of, you don't have a 15-60% increase in capacity, but you suddenly got all this additional capital, so prices go up, and then suddenly, the share capital declines, relatively speaking, and you're stuck with high prices. Is that a potential impact?
So we still think that capital deepening capital will contribute to growth over the next few years. So that I think of our product.
It'd be a worry if it didn't, but it's about the level of contribution and impact on growth.
Yeah, so it's very slightly lower than we had in our previous forecast, but they both still round to about 0.3% a year over the forecast. If you think about the business capital stock of the UK economy, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's very large. So these flows every year are quite small compared to the overall stock, and so you have to have kind of big changes in the flows of business investment to generate the big changes in the capital stock. So even this adjustment to business investment in our forecast doesn't have a hugely significant impact on capital deepening and productivity growth.
Okay, lastly from me on page 29, near the bottom of the page, below chart A, it says UK and global productivity growth between the early 90s and mid-2000s was likely boosted by rapid increase in trade as a share of GDP. UK trade intensity has stagnated since 2008 and we expect it to fall in the coming years due to the recent resurgence in global protectionism on top of the enduring effects of Brexit. This is set to weigh on productivity growth. And you go on in page 46 in the final paragraph there to say that weak growth over the medium term reflects a more restrictive global trade environment, as well as the ongoing impact of Brexit, which we continue to expect to reduce the overall trade intensity of the UK economy by 15% in the long term. So what is the implications of this on the UK finances to the end of the growth period, the forecast period?
So I don't have a specific number for exactly the impact of this on the UK government finances, but I'll talk a little bit about these different factors and trade and how that impacts productivity.
Sorry, a 15% reduction in overall trade intensity of the UK economy, which is, I mean, that's very significant.
Yeah, that's largely from Brexit, and so that would translate into a 4% reduction in the level of productivity of the UK economy, and we expect that to come in around 10 to 15 years after the UK left the EU, so say by 2030, 2035. So that is still weighing on productivity growth in the UK economy and therefore real GDP growth and the public finances over our forecast period and even slightly beyond it as well. As I mentioned earlier, there's a small offset to this from the trade deals the UK has signed to date. So,
yeah,
so a small offset.
So 4% versus 0.25%.
Yeah. And then you also mentioned the impact of global protectionism.
Indeed.
So you've seen US tariff rates rise very significantly since the end of 2024. As at September, which is when the IMF produced their World Economic Outlook, upon which we condition our forecast, rates on the UK had increased by around 8 percentage points. That's quite a very significant increase in tariffs, but slightly lower than the increase in tariffs on some of the US's other trading partners. So the UK was in a slightly relatively better position, although in a worse position than we were in, say, the end of 2024. And we think that impact on productivity of that increase in US tariffs on the UK and the kind of wider impact on slowing global trade from US protectionism is around minus 0.1%. So again, relatively small compared to a Brexit, but still a drag on UK productivity growth over the next 5 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for your evidence this morning. It's been very helpful to the committee. Just before we wind up, Tom, are there any further comments you feel you want to make? Anything you feel we should have touched on that we didn't, that you want to emphasise in terms of the
I don't think I have anything else to add. Don't know if my colleagues do. No.
Okay, well, with that, then, I shall call an end to this meeting. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions. There is no private session today.